my great pleasure that I get to introduce this evening's inspirational address, Hailey and Jon Scheinman. Now, they live in Clearwater, Florida with mom and wife, Allison, and twin sister and daughter, Olivia, known as Livy. Now, Livy was born with a brain malformation that resulted in difficult to control epilepsy, cerebral palsy, and other physical and mental disabilities. The Scheinman family created Lemonade for Livy and the Kids Crew, which are now both national initiatives of the Epilepsy Foundation. Hailey is the chair of the Epilepsy Foundation's Kids Crew Leadership Council. The Kids Crew is a nationwide effort to involve children in the mission of the foundation. Hailey is responsible for showing kids methods of creating awareness, asking them to share their stories of epilepsy, and encouraging them to participate in events that allow kids to give back. Earlier this year, Hailey was selected by Marvel as one of the 20 kids to be a part of the Marvel's Hero Project, airing now on Disney+. Hailey's episode focuses on the work she's done across the country to inspire hope, spread epilepsy awareness, and improve the lives of those impacted by epilepsy. Hailey's dad, Jon, is the director of youth programs at the Epilepsy Foundation. His daughter Livy's health challenges are what transformed him into an advocate and brought him to the foundation. Jon currently manages the Kid Crew program and is working to grow participation while helping members and their families make an impact no matter where they live. He is committed to supporting the community and believes that kids, regardless of how old they are, can make a big difference. So without further ado, Jon and Hailey Scheinman.
Okay.
Here we are.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. As Brianna said, my name is Jon Scheinman, and I am the director of youth programs at the Epilepsy Foundation.
My name is Hailey Scheinman, and I am the chair of the Kids Crew Leadership Council.
And we are from Clearwater, Florida, and we just made it through a tropical storm, and so it's nice to be with all of you in Michigan, and we're so happy to be here and to be able to share our story.
Yes, so we're so excited to get into this, and we're really going to be telling you about how honestly we turned lemons into lemonade.
That's right, and the big underlying concept there is that anybody can turn a challenge into action. We just happen to be a family that does it, and we can now talk about what we've done and hope other people can get involved also. So we are going to get started. Well, everybody has a journey, and it all starts someplace. And ours started almost 16 years ago now. The girls were born in December of 2004. And as you can see here, we had twins. And when you're pregnant with one, our first one, that's a pretty exciting time. But we found out we were having twins about 22 weeks into my wife Allison's pregnancy, and everything was going fine until 22 weeks, where she thought that there might be something going on, and she was concerned. So she went to the doctor, and she called me at work. I went down to also be with her at the doctor, and they did an ultrasound. And the doctor said to me, well, you might want to sit down. And so, of course, we're expecting bad news, but she says, you're having twins. And there it was. And so immediately, my perspective of life started changing. I thought, well, there's going to be 2 cribs and 2 kids going to school and 2 college educations and 2 cars and all of these different things that we hadn't been expecting. So we shifted and we prepared for it, and we thought everything was great. But as you're having twins, you're considered high risk. And so we had to have a number of ultrasounds done and more frequent checkups to make sure that the babies were developing okay. And so our first ultrasound did not go well. We were in the doctor's office, and the nurse practitioner who did all the measurements of the girls' brains and everything to make sure things were looking good said, you might want to hold on a minute here. I've got to get the doctor. And the doctor came in and started looking at the measurements and sat us down and basically said, baby A is okay, but baby B might have some trouble because one of her ventricles was too big. And he listed a number of different things that could happen, from being totally fine to being drastically disabled. And so when you hear that news, it's not good. And we left there and we got into our car and we broke down and we were in tears. And so over the next I guess it was 6 or 7 months or so, the measurements continued to get better. So we were really hopeful that everything was going to be fine. So on the day that the girls were born, the last measurement that they took, everything looked great. And we were ready to welcome twins into the world. Well, after Hailey was born, she was completely fine. She responded well. She was breathing and crying. When Livy was born, she wasn't crying when she came out. It took the nurses several minutes to get her to start breathing and eventually started crying. After about an hour or two, we were in our room and Allison was recovering. And then the pediatrician came in and said, well, Hailey's doing good, but we're going to send Livy over to the NICU, which happened to be adjacent to the hospital we were in. There was a children's hospital. And she said, she's doing some strange eye movements, and I'm not quite sure what it is, but I want to watch her. So I remember vividly the staff came in, they took Livy, they put her into a crib, and they wheeled her down the hall as I was following, and they wheeled her underneath the tunnel that was connecting the two hospitals. And they found her a spot in the NICU, and I was standing next to her. And just waiting, this environment was completely new to me. I'd never been in a NICU before, and so there were other families sitting by the sides of their newborns. And as I'm looking down at Livy, and she's looking back up at me, and she starts to stiffen, and then she starts to shake. And that was her first tonic-clonic seizure, only hours after birth. And that is really where our journey begins with epilepsy, with disabilities, because Livy also has cerebral palsy. She cannot walk or talk, and she's in a wheelchair. And we didn't know what to expect along the road. And it has been really, really difficult, I will say. She's had multiple brain surgeries. Her second was a hemispherectomy back in 2009. And she has progressed in her own way, but she still is completely reliant on her family for care. And it's really changed our family. Epilepsy, as they say, affects everyone in the family, and it really does. My career has changed. I have different friends. My wife, Allison, is Livy's full-time caregiver. Her career changed. Hailey wouldn't be the same person she is today without what we experienced along the journey. And we wouldn't be able to do these things, though, of course. And we also happen to travel around the country. And so it doesn't always change in a bad way. It just is different, and we have to learn how to adjust. But what I really remember too is that during Livy's second surgery, her hemispherectomy, we had all of the great expectations that would be her answer. That was gonna stop all of her seizures. And so after her surgery was over, we went into her room, and she was lying there with a breathing tube, and all the lights were beeping, and her eyes were closed. They were covered up with, or they were swollen. They were closed, and she began to have a seizure right after surgery. And I had to leave the room because I thought epilepsy had beat me at that point. But when I came back into the room after about 10 minutes or so, I went up to her and I said, Livy, I promise you, I will never leave you ever again. And I will do everything I can to try and help you and give you the best life possible. And we have continued to do that over the years. But I still think, and my wife Allison still believes, that if Hailey wasn't there to bring us joy and to bring us laughter, that it would have been so much more difficult. And Hailey was also there for Livy along the way, and still is today. And that love is just amazing to watch.
Thank you. And honestly, throughout my entire life, Livy has really been one of my best friends. We've always stuck together, and I've always wanted to support her, and I feel like she supports me as well. I've said before that Livy can't stand, but she stands for hope. honestly, she has been the inspiration for all the things that my family has done. I mean, she has always been there for me. It's from whether I've had a bad day and her smile makes me feel so much better, to literally inspiring my whole family to give back to others. She is the starting point for everything that we've done, and I am so grateful to have her in my life. Some people may say, well, maybe there's some things in your life that are different from other people's, but I think those differences are good too, because she's given us a whole different perspective, and I'm so fortunate to be able to have that experience with her.
So along our journey, there was a point where we made a choice. People make choices all the time, but when a family is struggling with a major health issue, especially with one of their kids, there are choices made. There are difficult choices made, and often they're emotional choices or financial choices. But we made the choice to choose hope over fear. And I'm not talking about the optimistic type of hope where you're sitting there and you're hoping everything just turns out okay. I'm talking about the actionable hope where you have a plan, you have a goal, you're going to do everything you possibly can to reach that goal. And then you hope that it turns out the way that you anticipated it would. That's the kind of hope I'm talking about. And we made a choice to start helping other families that were going through what we were going through. We had so much experience by this time. So much experience was because Livy was so severe and so chronic that we had amassed so much knowledge about epilepsy and about special needs that we really wanted to share with people. And so we created a website called Livy's Hope. And we blogged, we talked about our experience, we offered advice to people, and we wanted to be a source of information for other families so they didn't have to go through what we had gone through, because it was the most difficult times in our lives. And everyone's experience is different, but we felt that if we could at least give a little bit of insight about what we had been through, then maybe we could help somebody who was going through a hard time so they just didn't have to have the hard time that we did. And so we were very open about sharing our story, and we still are today, because we really feel that in order for other people to learn, in order for the conversation to progress forward, sharing your story is so incredibly important to do that.
And like my dad said before, having someone in the family with special needs has affected the entire family, but also Livy's Hope has affected the entire family in such a positive, great way. We have all been working together on this, and like it says there, it's a family effort. We honestly are like a puzzle, so each piece is necessary for this all to work, and it's brought us all so much closer together, and I'm so grateful for that. And what's also great is that Livy's Hope has helped to make a community impact in our area. Over the years, we have helped to support different organizations helping others, like the Ronald McDonald House and Wheelchairs for Kids. As you can see on here, I've done presentations in my classroom about Livy, so the kids know what epilepsy and special needs are. And we've also started several programs, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. But really our biggest message has been hope. That's what we have focused on the most. We want to give other people hope. Our family's motto is don't give up, give back. It's also Livy's Hope's motto. And this has been just crucial to everything, getting my parents through Livy's hard times, and this is the message we want to spread to other people, that when you're going through a hard time in life, don't give up. Keep pushing forward and give back to other people, because in addition to making other people feel good, it makes you feel good too. So that's our core mission, is to spread that message to other people. So now we're going to be showing you a video about Don't Give Up, Give Back. And this was from a few years ago, so you're going to hear my voice being a little bit higher, and I'm going to be a little bit tinier, but we really think that this shows the message of Don't Give Up, Give Back.
And as many of you may have seen videos on Zoom, it might be a little bit choppy. The sound should be okay, but just bear with us because the message is a good message.
I see a world that knows no limits, where hope is stronger than fear. We all have a purpose, where everyone matters. Where the strong stand up for others, where disability is ability. Where anything is possible when we work together. Where we create a better tomorrow, not only for us, but for generations to come. If you are lost on your journey, don't stop searching. If you are hurting, know that you are not alone. If you fall, pick yourself up and keep going. Let your determination guide you. Be extraordinary. Stay inspired. Miracles happen every day. Believe in yourself. Don't give up. You will grow into so much more. You can change the world. This is your chance. We are all artists. Find your canvas and paint it with wonder. Pick a path with your heart and start something that matters. Don't wait until tomorrow. Someone needs you now. It takes one act of kindness to inspire a movement. Start yours and watch it spread. Open your heart. Be compassionate. Make someone's dream come true. Sacrifice for another. You were born with greatness. Use it to help those in need. You can make a difference. When you do, you will be changed forever.
I hope you enjoyed that video. We always enjoy watching that again. But you can tell in that video that one of the main messages is that you can make a difference. And I'll get into Lemonade for Livy here, which you might have heard of before, but Lemonade for Livy is one of those ways we encourage people to make a difference, specifically to make a stand against epilepsy. So in general, Lemonade for Livy is an event that the Epilepsy Foundation has every year to encourage people all over to have lemonade stands and parties and events to raise money for epilepsy research and programs and services. So this really is the effort of so many people, but it all started from one lemonade stand. And you may have seen in that video some little kids in there who were my friends, and we did do a lot of talking to my friends about what epilepsy is, and they knew who Livy was. So we knew it was great to start at a really young age so they would be more accepting in the future. So two of my friends who are sisters, they decided to have a lemonade stand. This was a while ago, 10 years ago, in fact. They decided to have a lemonade stand to raise money for Livy, and they called it Lemonade for Livy. So they sold their lemonade and they raised money and they told us about it. And we thought that was an incredible, amazing idea because lemonade stands are so simple and it's such an easy way for kids to be able to raise money. So we decided to take that on ourselves and use it to help other people. So as time passed, we eventually partnered up with the Epilepsy Foundation to make this a national event at the Epilepsy Foundation. And it's been amazing to see where it's been able to grow from there. And we always tell people that it's not about just one lemonade stand or one person raising money. It's about the tens of thousands of cups of lemonade that have been sold, every dollar, every person that has put every minute into doing this, all of those things adding up together. That's what matters. Every cup matters. And we are so grateful for all of that that's been done. And another thing that's awesome is that this is empowering kids to do things. They're bringing out their table and they've got their little pitcher of lemonade, their little cups, and they're not just selling lemonade, but they're also spreading epilepsy awareness to those in their community. And they're telling them what epilepsy is. They're telling them about their story, why they're having a lemonade stand, why their decorations are purple. And that's just, by so many kids doing this, that just keeps spreading all over the place every year. And by these kids doing that, it's helping them to build confidence. Like kids who may have been scared to talk to others or who've been shy, by doing this, it's helping to build their confidence, and they're going to take that with them into the future. So I'm just so excited to see where these kids continue to take this to. So a while ago, about when this was starting, I made a goal with my dad. We said, hey, maybe one day we could raise $1 million through Lemonade for Livy. Wouldn't that be great? We weren't really sure, we were hopeful, but we didn't really know exactly if we could get there. But as of now, we have raised almost $800,000 through Lemonade for Livy. And we're getting so close, but it's, again, people every year that contribute to this. And I have no doubt that we will get to 1 million. We're on track to do that. And it's because of all of that effort from so many people.
Yeah, it really is amazing to see that it's not just kids who get involved. There are families, there's businesses, there's teenagers who are older, there's older individuals, there's companies. It's not just a kids event, and we've seen some really creative activities, whether it's a ladies' night in, whether it's an event at a hotel, just a happy hour, whether it's games. We had an event several years ago that was around sporting. And so we call it the Lemon Games. And so there's really creativity that we get to see. And one of the biggest and best things that the campaign had was a sponsor who's since gone out of business, but Shopko was a company out in the Midwest who had 380 plus stores. And they raised a lot of money at their stores by having pinups, which you can see in one of the pictures there, for a full month. And so that was a really great partnership with them. And so we always look for other organizations and companies that want to be involved to help us take the campaign forward, because that only helps the epilepsy community in the end. And so one of the other things that started because of our family and Livy's Hope is the Epilepsy Foundation Kids Crew. And there was one day, I guess it was probably about 8 or 9 years ago now, where Hailey and I were sitting at the kitchen table, and we were just throwing around ideas about how to get kids involved in a bigger way, to do some good things in their community and to learn. And we came up with this concept of the Kids Crew. And at that point, it was a way to bring Hailey's and Livy's friends together to teach them about disabilities and about certain conditions that kids had, because we always have felt that the earlier you teach kids about the experiences of other kids, the more they are willing to learn, the more they accept kids for who they are, and just the more knowledgeable about what's going on around them. So we brought these kids together on a monthly basis. We had a nonprofit come in, talk to the kids about what their mission was, and then the kids did something good for the nonprofit, whether it was fundraising, whether it was putting packages together to deliver to moms at the Ronald McDonald House. It was just a really great way for kids and families to get involved. And so now it has evolved over time to become specifically more about epilepsy. And that happened. It was kind of a fluke. I am fortunate enough to work for the Epilepsy Foundation at a national level. And one of my first trips when I got to the foundation almost 5 years ago was to Indiana. And I was talking to a number of community members there about getting involved with the foundation and just what the organization was doing in the area. And I had the opportunity to talk to a mom who had lost her son to epilepsy. And it was the first time she had spoken in public about it. And so it was a really moving meeting. And I got home the following day and I was telling Hailey about this mom. And this is little Hailey. I guess she was probably about, well, I guess it was 5 years ago, so not too young, but probably 10 years old. And she said, well, how can I get involved with the foundation to do more as well? And so the CEO at the time, I was telling him about this, and he said, well, I know about the kids crew. Why don't you bring a kids crew and start it at the Epilepsy Foundation? And so that is exactly what we did. We said, let's change the kids crew. Let's make it specifically around creating a space for kids to get involved with the mission of the foundation, where they can learn about epilepsy, they can teach others, they can participate in events, they can come together in a way where they can see that they are not alone, and they can really help change the conversation around the stigma with epilepsy and spread acceptance and awareness wherever they live. That's the beauty of it. Kids can participate no matter where they live. And they get to complete activities to earn pins. You can see that there are some kids here with their lanyards, with their pins. They get to be a part of walks around the country. They can hold their lemonade stands wherever they are. They can teach their classmates about epilepsy. And so it's been just a phenomenal way for kids to get involved with the foundation. And it's not just kids who have epilepsy. It's kids who either have epilepsy, who have a sibling with epilepsy, who may have a parent with epilepsy or friends. Really, anybody can get involved because, as we know, we're a tight-knit small community, but the minute that we start getting more people involved, the easier it is to get our message of awareness and acceptance out there for the epilepsy community. And so we have almost 3,400 members now in every state around the country, and even outside of the US too, who are participating. And it grows every day. And it's amazing to see what these kids are doing. They are out there in their communities. They don't feel alone after they join because they get to see other kids who are just like them. And that is one of the biggest things that we have seen is that kids, when their parents sign them up for the program, say, I really want my child to know somebody else with epilepsy because I feel like they're the only one. Well, this is one of the best ways for them to see that that is just not true. They get to see kids at events online. They used to be in person locally. There are some local events that happen, but we have national kids crew events that are online, and so they can be a part and they can see other kids. And so the message that families are telling us is that the program is really helping their kids feel like they're a part of something. It's helping them take control. It's helping them be empowered to say, yes, I might have epilepsy, but look what I can do because of it now. And so the kids are starting to look at epilepsy in a different way, and they are getting out there and they are making an impact. And it's going to be amazing to see where the program is in 5 or 10 years from now, because these kids, they're doing it, right?
Yes, they are. And I've been asked in the past, do you think kids can change the world? And at this point, the answer is a solid yes, because in fact, they are changing the world right now. And I've seen it in the kids crew. These kids are inspiring me to do more. I've seen them, you can see on this slide too in the images. I mean, these kids are presenting about epilepsy to their classrooms, about their stories too. They're talking to legislators. They are painting their pumpkins purple to create awareness. They're holding events. They're participating in walks. All of these things, and it starts to add up too. Over the years, it's been so incredible to see these kids take this on. And this builds confidence too. And some of these kids who have epilepsy, they learn that they're not alone. And these kids too maybe have been told before, well, you're too young to make a difference. And here they're learning that that's not true. and they're learning their potential. And really, these kids are helping to change the way that the world sees epilepsy for the better. And I think that that is just incredible. And these kids being able to realize their potential, I think that that is one of the greatest aspects of the Kids Crew.
Now, of course, we would be remiss if we didn't give a shout out to the two girls in the picture farthest to the left. That's Bella and Kenzie, and they are Michigan natives. They appeared in the Kids Crew quarterly newsletter that came out about a month ago, and they are making a real impact there in Michigan. You can see they participated in the stroll in one of the towns, and they're doing it there. They have earned a number of their pins and completed activities, and they're a perfect example of somebody from Michigan in a family who is making a significant difference because of who they are and what they're trying to get out of the program.
Okay, so those that know me personally know that I really like Marvel superheroes. So you can imagine my surprise when I figured out that I had been selected to be a part of Marvel's Hero Project, which was explained earlier, but again, it's a 20-episode documentary about kids who are doing great things in their communities, and it's on Disney+. I think it's amazing because it's given me the opportunity to share my family's story to an even bigger audience, and people who may not even be involved with epilepsy, they're able to be kind of led in too. You can see here that Marvel made a comic book that has Livy and me on the front, and flipping through that comic book, it's honestly like I was kind of flipping through my life and seeing how everything came to where it is. And that comic book is called Hi Flying Hailey, and it was pretty exciting. But even seeing all these other kids who are in the other episodes, like they're helping to show that kids can change the world too. It's the same message again. We're all working together to show kids can and are making a difference. One of the reasons that I love Marvel superheroes is because of their backstory. They all, well, I know at least for the majority of them, they came to a point in their life with some kind of issue or problem, and that they had a choice then to either just give up and give in to whatever it was, or they could turn it around and use that to help others. And that's what they chose to do. And I think that goes right alongside don't give up, give back. And anyone who has done something great in this world has some kind of backstory, some kind of motivation for this. And we have a backstory too with everything with Livy, motivating us to want to do more. So I want you guys to think about, what is your backstory going to be? What is your motivation? And if you come to a point in your life where there is a problem and you have to choose, take the opportunity to do something to help others, to give back, and to do something great. I have seen in my life that one thing leads to another. And looking back, I would have never thought at the start of this, raising money, Marvel superhero, that would have seemed insane. But it also didn't happen overnight or with like a snap or something. It didn't happen that quickly. It came from one small step and more small steps over time to get to where we are. So if you're trying to start something that you're passionate about and you're just not sure if you can do it, if you feel like, you know, I have a goal, but it's just so far away and I don't know if I'll be able to get there, just know that it's one small step at a time, maybe even some back steps. But if you keep going along, you might be able to get to a place you never even dreamed that you could. And through Marvel's Hero Project, our huge message is that anyone can be a hero. Anyone can be a hero. Everyone has the potential to start something that can change the world. You just have to get out and do it.
And I think that leads right into, we all have a choice. I said it in the beginning with our family. We made an active choice to get involved and to do something and to give back to others. And to Hailey's point, anyone can do that. You may not be in a position to do it now because you either have a child or a relative, or you are going through something really traumatic, and that's okay. But if you get to a place where you feel you're comfortable and your life is settled enough, you can choose to do something amazing. I said in the beginning, when we were told that we were having twins, that our perspective changed at that point. Our perspective has changed 360 degrees about what we thought life was going to be like with kids after Livy was born. But that perspective is also what keeps our feet grounded and really helps us to realize what is important in life now. And through all of our efforts, through giving, through working with families, through working with kids, that continues to allow us to see that we made the right choice. And some people often say, I don't know how to get going. I don't know what to do. I'm not sure where to focus my energy. We have always said that everyone has a talent that can be used to do something good for others or to make a difference. Oftentimes it's that it starts with a passion about a cause or about something that you see in the world that needs to be changed. And that's where the energy comes from to progress forward. Everyone has a talent that can be used. And I have not met anybody or seen anybody who doesn't have something. It's just a matter of finding out what you think your talent is and how you can use it to help others. Because really, each of us can make a difference. We're all born with gifts and with talents, and we just, again, need to use those to make a difference in the world, because there are a lot of people who are going through things where they can use help. And I have heard it a number of times where I might be one family who's looking at another family who has it worse than we do. And that is true in many cases. Why not help the other family, right? Or why not find a group of people who need to be helped, or an organization that needs to be helped? We focused a lot of our energy on helping the Epilepsy Foundation even before I became an employee, because we wanted to make a difference in the epilepsy community. And I saw a movie last week called The Secret Dare to Dream, and there was a quote that I thought really stood out. And it reads there, whatever happens, even the bad stuff can lead to better things. And that is around having hope. And again, it's not just the optimistic type of hope. It's basically saying that no matter what happens to me or to my family, we're going to turn this into something good, because we are not going to let life push us down so far that we can't get back up. And so we always tell families, just look what your talents are, because you can use that to make a real difference in someone else's life.
And another crucial thing that I outlined a little bit earlier with Lemonade for Livy is that working together is so important. None of the things that we've done would have been possible if other people hadn't stepped in and helped. So you can do things by yourself, but when you work together with other people, think of just how much more you're able to accomplish. Because when we all come together to work for something, there's nothing that we can't do. So we're getting pretty close to the end here, but I just want to let you guys know that whatever your journey was before here, it's led you right here to this very moment. So now you're coming to a choice, kind of like just like my family did so many years ago. And this is really what you can take with you to the future. You have a choice to give back to others. You have a choice to help others and to do something amazing. So I want to ask you guys, what will you choose to do?
And with that, I would like to leave you with a quote from Nelson Mandela, that it always seems impossible until it's done. And when we were at our worst, when we were watching Livy go through hundreds of seizures a day, we never thought it was going to get better. We thought it was impossible to get better. We couldn't have imagined ourselves going out there and starting 2 national initiatives that have reached people around the country and in various countries. We never thought that was going to be possible until it was. until we made a point of choosing to do something to give back. And that's, I think, where we will leave it. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your conference. And I think now, if anyone has any questions, they can feel free to ask them.
Okay, thank you so much, Jon and Hailey. That was so inspirational. And again, I do encourage people to submit any questions that you may have through the Q&A feature. We've got about 14 minutes until we move on to the next session, so we got plenty of time to chat here. You know, again, to reiterate what one of your key messages, it's just so important to realize that we all have experiences and knowledge that can help us to bring about positive change in the epilepsy community. So can you talk about maybe some key moments that maybe stand out in your memory, that either experiences or emotional states that kind of led to you taking one of those first steps in terms of taking an action?
Sure. And Livy has spent many nights and days and months in the hospital. And I think that one of the real big changes for me was after her hemispherectomy, when we thought that everything was going to be okay until it wasn't. And it was a realization that we're going to have to live with this and try and find other avenues to help Livy than just surgery. And so that really led us down the path of, are we going to let this beat us, or are we going to try and do something about it to help Livy, but then in turn try and help other people? So it beat us down so much, and we were in such an awful emotional state that we could have stayed there. We could have stayed in that dark place, but we chose not to. And so I think anybody who has, especially a child who was watching their child go through it, and you just can't help them, you just don't know what to do, they can easily fall into that state. But it's really at the darkest time that we found the brightest light, because we just refused to give up and to live our lives unhappy and in fear all the time.
Hailey, do you have anything to add to that? Can you recall any particular memories where maybe you were in a place of feeling kind of sad or despair, and something about that moved you towards an action?
Yeah, I think, you know, there have been a few moments like that. I think one thing that does stand out though, and there actually is a video about this on YouTube, but there was one point, this was several years ago, again, when my voice was higher, but Livy had just had a seizure on the couch. And at that point, like, I just felt so upset that I couldn't do anything, because I'd seen my whole life Livy having seizures, but like at that moment, just something happened where I was so upset. And I said, I want to film a video right now. So I kind of, in the middle of me almost crying, I just talked right into the video camera about how I was upset and I wanted Livy's seizures to stop, and I wanted to do something for her seizures to stop. So I've thought back to that several times, just thinking that was a moment when I really realized, and it really clicked, that I couldn't do something about her seizures at that moment. So several times I've gone back and watched that video again, and I think that just that keeps bringing me empowerment to see how motivated I was at that moment. So I think it's that feeling of not being able to do something for Livy when she's having seizures. I think that's a lot of what drives me to keep doing this, so we can stop the seizure someday, so we can find other things for her. And you know, I just want her to be able to stop having seizures. So I think it's those experiences, definitely.
Thanks for sharing that. We have a couple of questions from the audience. One says, tell us how your relationship between you and your sister, and how did you handle it when epilepsy gets in the way with life?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, first of all, I think it's great to say that I have a really great relationship with Livy. And I mean, we never argue, we never steal each other's things. We always get along really well, but I think it's comparing to friends such a unique experience. And I always feel comfortable around Livy. And we love spending time together. I've read her books before. Sometimes she's like spinning pinwheels. We watch movies together. And in some cases, it's a lot simpler. Like even I work with her sometimes to help her sit up a little bit better. But I'm so grateful for that because I feel like I've been able to kind of see a different side of things. And I mean, it always feels like she's there for me. And her smile can always make you feel better. As for dealing with epilepsy, in a way, it's all I've ever known. I haven't ever had a sister without epilepsy, but still, I mean, it makes me upset every time she has seizures. Thankfully, they're a lot better under control now than they used to be, but still every time, sometimes we'll be going on like a week streak without seizures and then she'll have one again and it's like, again. So it's always, with my entire family, it's always just kind of a guessing game, not knowing when something's going to change, when we might have to cancel something. But I still think in a lot of ways, the good things outweigh the bad. So I'm always so grateful for Livy.
Patience has definitely been a thing that our family relies on often because we in the past have been late. We have to cancel. I mean, all of the things that families know about, we've experienced too. All of those things that come along with it. So patience has definitely been something that we've asked from our family, our friends to try and have with us as we work through all the challenges.
Great. Another attendee was interested with Hailey, with you having done so much already at such a young age. The attendee was interested in knowing what your career aspirations are.
Yeah, I've actually been considering that lately a little bit more, but I know that I really love science, and physics, so astrophysicist is on the board, but then I was also thinking lately too, how I think activism might be really interesting. I've participated in the Epilepsy Foundation's Teen Speak Up program, kind of acting there for my sister, and I really enjoyed doing that too. So I guess I don't really know right now, but I know that with whatever I do, I'll always make it a goal to help other people.
That's great. Can you talk a little bit, just with Halloween having just recently happened, can you talk a little bit about the origin story of the Purple Pumpkin Project?
Yeah, I'll take that one if you want. And it's amazing how many purple pumpkins there were this year. And it started with a gentleman up in Connecticut, and he was driving home with his family through some of the fields, and he was trying to think about a way to spread awareness because his son had epilepsy. And as they were watching the pumpkins kind of go by, they thought, well, what if we paint our pumpkins purple? And so as the story goes, when people started asking them why their pumpkins were purple, they were able to tell them facts about epilepsy and to spread awareness. And it grew really, really quickly throughout the years. And it's one of the most popular activities within the kids crew, but even really in the epilepsy community across the country. And this year, especially because of COVID-19, there was an effort that was started somewhere, we believe out in California, where people were going to put purple pumpkins out on their doorstep to let others know that it was a safe house to trick or treat at. And so there was a lot of coverage around, well, is that going to really be confusing for people who think that purple pumpkins are for epilepsy awareness? And so there was a lot of discussion around that. And we really felt strongly that, one of the interesting things that have come out of all this is that a lot of awareness was spread for epilepsy because the story got picked up and was spread kind of far and wide across the web, and there were interviews done. And so it really helped get the word out there around epilepsy this year in a much bigger way. So I'm sure that it was confusing for some people, but we also told people if they see a purple pumpkin and you're trick-or-treating, thank the family for putting it out there, because they're also spreading epilepsy awareness.
Right. I'll wait. We have a couple more minutes if anyone wants to submit any more questions. But one thing I wanted to encourage, kind of to build off of this, is for people to, if people want to join a group to kind of brainstorm ideas in Michigan of what we could do to become more active, or to turn our experience into action, is we do have our Call and Connect network. We have 3 separate groups, one for parents, we have one for adults with epilepsy, and one for young adults, ages 18 through 25. So that would be, I know we've already, several of those groups we've already talked about, okay, what things can we do to raise awareness? What can we do to get involved in public policy, advocacy, or fundraising? So that is a great way to kind of meet other people in the epilepsy community and sort of think about ways to, again, turn that experience into action. So we did get one other question here. So Hailey, what do you do outside of advocating and helping others? Do you have any hobbies?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really love to do is art. So that's been really there my entire life. And I mean, I originally too, back in the beginning of Libby's Hope, I sold some of my art paintings and bracelets to help raise money for Libby. But more around now, I like doing photography, and I also have a drawing tablet too, which has been nice because you can kind of do all sorts of art. There's a painting option and a drawing option. So that's kind of been my multi-tool for doing things too. And I honestly love spending time with my family. Like we said before, with everything that we've done together, we've just become really close. And I feel like I can always rely on my family. So we like playing games together and watching movies together and sometimes cooking together. So really there's a lot of different things that we can all do together that I enjoy doing.
Yeah, this experience it's been challenging, and we often ask Hailey, do you ever regret or have jealousy, or you can't do certain things that your friends have done? But never once has she ever said, I don't want to be with you, or I'd rather be doing something else. And we're really fortunate that we do get along so well as a family, because honestly, that's one of the things that my wife and I are most proud of, is that we built a family that we're proud of, and that focuses on what's important in life, and we always try and do as much as we can to help others, and we do it as a family because we enjoy being together too.
Well, that's great, and I just want to thank you both for taking the time to be with us this evening and sharing your story. It's, again, so inspirational, and I hope everyone takes something from that and starts thinking about, what can I do? What can I do to help the larger epilepsy community, to raise awareness, to raise funds, to make a difference in the community. So thanks so much. We're going to move on to our next presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
So next up, we have Aim for Zero, Finding Your Path Towards Seizure Freedom. And we are pleased to have as our presenter, Dr. Asad Yousuf, who's an epileptologist from the Henry Ford Comprehensive Epilepsy Center. And we'd also like to thank the Henry Ford Comprehensive Epilepsy Center for sponsoring this session. So Dr. Yousuf, if you could show your video and share your screen, we'll go ahead and get started.
All right, thanks so much, and thanks for having me. All right. So I'm going to be talking, so the title of the talk is Aim for Zero, Finding Your Path Towards Seizure Freedom. And, the aim today is really to hit on the importance of early referral to a comprehensive epilepsy center, and kind of an emphasis on the various treatment options for drug-resistant epilepsy. But I thought, we would start with the case. A 25-year-old man presented for evaluation after having a generalized tonic-clonic seizure at home. He was previously diagnosed with psychogenic non-epileptic seizures at age 23. When asked to describe his events, he stated that he often woke up from sleep and had tonic posturing of his arms and legs. He specifically stated that his right arm was extended and his left arm was flexed toward his chest. At the end of the seizure, he had several clonic jerks of his entire body. He stated that he's fully aware throughout the events, but cannot speak because he cannot control his mouth. A typical seizure would last approximately 20 seconds. He often had clusters with 5 to 10 seizures per cluster. Immediately following the event, he felt weak, but within 30 to 60 seconds, he felt normal. He had been evaluated at a local hospital, had a normal EEG during one of those events. And so based on that fact, that he was aware and recalled events, and despite having motor findings, but with a negative EEG during the events, he was diagnosed with the non-epileptic seizures, and he was treated by a behavioral psychologist. And after that, there was no change in his event, no relief in his events. So, we'll just show his MRI. So this is, imagine if you were looking at someone straight ahead, so sort of head on, and you were taking slices of the brain. So this is the right side, this is the left side. There's this area of kind of thickening, and it's a little brighter there. There's a little tail here. It's a little subtle, but these are findings compatible with a focal cortical dysplasia, and these are sort of abnormalities in kind of brain development that you're born with, but we see it frequently implicated in seizures. And he was brought in for epilepsy, or he was brought into the epilepsy monitoring unit, and several of his typical seizures were captured. And, it's kind of beyond the scope of this to really get into the EEG, but these are kind of the midline leads. So these are electrodes recording from the middle of the head. And, he had this electrographic signature before each of his seizures, this kind of run of fast activity. So this is a pretty subtle finding for seizures. But, the purpose of, after that, he was diagnosed with epilepsy. He was started on a anti-epileptic, and then afterwards he was seizure-free. And, the purpose of describing that case, really was to go to the fact that even experienced physicians, experienced epileptologists, hearing the clinical history, you may miss, you may not be able to, straight away diagnose epilepsy. And so in refractory cases, it's really important to push for, actually recording the seizures. It's probably beyond the scope of this talk in terms of, subtleties between non-epileptic seizures and frontal lobe seizures. But anytime the cases are refractory, I think it's important to actually come into an epilepsy center, have the seizures recorded to get a clear diagnosis. And with that, we'll kind of shift into talking about drug-resistant epilepsy, and hopefully in kind of hitting on some different things, we'll be able to tie into why it's important to refer early to an epilepsy center. But our current definition of drug-resistant epilepsy is defined as the failure of adequate trials of 2 tolerated and appropriately chosen and used anti-epileptic drugs. Drug-resistant epilepsy affects about 1/3 of people with epilepsy. So you can imagine about 2/3 on average would respond to 1 or 2 medicines. The remaining 1/3 don't really respond to medicines. And we know already that patients with epilepsy have a worse quality of life, family function, compared to other patients who are chronically ill. And most importantly, patients with drug-resistant epilepsy face an increased risk of sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. So surgical approaches to epilepsy have been around really since the 1950s, but Over time, we've developed some new techniques, and we're going to be hitting on those, but including laser ablation as well as some of the newer neurostimulation devices. Now, this is a nice flow chart. Now, this is adapted from an article in Continuum, which is a journal put out by the American Academy of Neurology, but I thought it was a really useful kind of understanding of how to think about refractory epilepsy and sort of which steps to go when. And so we'll be coming back to this chart through the presentation, but just to kind of take you through it. So, the first step, of course, is a diagnosis of epilepsy. Typically that's defined by having 2 seizures separated by 24 hours, or 1 seizure and the probability of having another seizure at greater than 60% over a 2-year period. Usually that's based on testing, or diagnosis clearly of a typical epilepsy syndrome, such as absence epilepsy or some of the childhood epilepsy syndromes. So the first step always is to try your first anti-epileptic drug, and basically if seizures respond to that, obviously you will always monitor for side effects or that specific medication in terms of adverse effects that it may have, but you're going to continue, for the most part, you're going to continue that medication. If seizures continue despite that first drug, then you're going to try a second one, and that one can be used in combination with the first, or it can be used on its own. And same thing, you're basically going to assess for improvement in seizures. And I think a good trial generally would be sort of 1 or 2 months or so, but if you keep having seizures, then clearly it's not successful. So once you've failed that second AED, that's really when the guidance is really that at that point, you really should be referred to an epilepsy center to look at other options for treatment of epilepsy. And we'll talk about in a little bit why that is and why that's important. And then, we'll focus on these 4 boxes a little bit later, kind of individually more so, but what's going to happen once you're at a comprehensive epilepsy center? Well, you're probably going to see a specialist in seizures, an epileptologist, and they're going to look at a number of things in terms of, were the medications correct for the types of seizures that you have? Was it at the correct dose? And it's at this point that it can also be considered about sort of what we would call like lifestyle therapies for seizures. So for example, if there are medical comorbidities that can worsen seizures, for example, like obstructive sleep apnea, or in women, for example, hormonal therapies for epilepsy, or dietary therapies such as the ketogenic diet or modified Atkins diet, those can be considered. If the epilepsy is truly drug resistant and refractory, that's when you're going to go into an evaluation for possible surgical resection and other treatment options. Usually that involves a lot of testing, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But from there, it'll be kind of decided whether the pre-surgical testing, non-invasive testing was enough, or if you need a little bit more invasive testing to figure out where seizures are coming from. And that's when we talk about intracranial monitoring. And then, once all that's done, then we can talk about various options for treatment of epilepsy other than medicine. So for example, surgical resection, laser ablation, and then the neurostimulation devices, which are responsive neurostimulation, or RNS, vagal nerve stimulation, and deep brain stimulation. And, it's important to understand, this is not, every patient is different, and, everyone's epilepsy is different. So not everyone is going to require every single type of test. And, different patients may be able to skip the process in different ways. Generally speaking, this entire process would take a good 6 to 8 months. And the case would be discussed usually in a multidisciplinary setting with, neuroradiologists, epileptologists, neurosurgeons to kind of decide what the best option is in terms of surgical treatment. So, what we know about epilepsy surgery, in terms of the randomized controlled trials, and the landmark one was in 2001, but, basically it's been proven over and over that for refractory epilepsy, there is no better treatment. Based on that Class A evidence, the American Academy of Neurology, as well as the American Epilepsy Society and the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, they had put out a practice guideline in 2003 that patients, for whom appropriate trials of first-line AEDs had failed should be considered for referral to an epilepsy center. Despite that, when we look at referral patterns, they really have not changed significantly in the years that have followed. So according to one estimate, only 1% of patients with drug-resistant epilepsy are referred to an epilepsy center. And usually this occurs an average of more than 20 years after the onset of their epilepsy. And the reasons for this are pretty varied, but usually have to do with patients and families' fears, as well as healthcare provider lack of knowledge about epilepsy surgery, as well as healthcare access issues. So, kind of wanted to hit on some of the barriers that prevent timely referral for patients with drug-resistant epilepsy. So, probably the most common misconception is that epilepsy surgery is dangerous, and obviously it's a major undertaking. We're talking about brain surgery, but according to systematic review, major complications are reported in about 1.5%, minor complications in about 5.1%. The most common is a CSF leak, so that's the fluid that's surrounding the brain and your spinal cord. Major complications were reported in about 4.7% of patients, minor in about 10.9% of patients. The most common is some changes in the or minor visual field deficits. Perioperative mortality is rare, about 0.4% in temporal lobe cases and about 1.2% in cases that are outside the temporal lobe. So, when you compare this against other major surgeries, that complication rate is really not that bad, especially when you consider the danger of continuing uncontrolled seizures. One of the other barriers that we see, of course, is about how cognitive and memory changes, or how that will change after surgery. And this is something that's taken pretty seriously whenever someone is being worked up for epilepsy surgery. So, part of the testing usually always includes neuropsychological testing to kind of get a baseline of what the memory function is and cognitive function is before a surgery, and to give a sort of better estimate of how things will be after surgery. And what we see, it is fair to say that sometimes there can be declines in verbal memory and naming after surgery, but we've also seen gains in verbal memory as well as verbal fluency. And you can imagine when you treat refractory epilepsy and you're not having seizures anymore, you can imagine that memory and function generally will improve. And then one of the biggest misconceptions is really about there's always a sense that the next medicine is going to fix things. I think particularly in the community setting, especially with epilepsy, we have it seems like there's always a new medicine on the horizon or coming out. There's a thought that, well, maybe it'll respond to this. But what we know from studies is that only 11% of patients with epilepsy become seizure-free after the failure of the first anti-seizure medication, and only 3% of patients with epilepsy become seizure-free after failure of the second medicine. So, the chances of become seizure-free after trial or failure of two medicines is pretty low, and that's where the guideline really comes in, as we talked about before, that any patient for whom two seizure medications have failed, that's when you really should be referred to an epilepsy center for the evaluation for consideration of surgical and other options for epilepsy treatment. One of the other things that comes up is about, for example, if there's not a clear lesion or a clear explanation on the MRI for why you would have seizures. And we see this a lot in epilepsy. And, one of the studies showed that 60% of patients with histologically confirmed focal cortical dysplasia, which I'd mentioned earlier as one of the abnormalities, typically seen in causing seizures. So they would have normal MRIs when performed and reported at an outside a major epilepsy center, but only 37% of those were still normal when reviewed at an epilepsy center. And, that's not, meant to boost that the reading is, much, much superior at an epilepsy center, but it shows that when you're taking all the data, so when you're taking, the patient's clinical symptoms during a seizure combined with what you see on an EEG during a seizure, and you're taking those and kind of have a hypothesis about where seizures may be coming from, and you're looking closely at the MRI, sometimes you can identify subtle findings that were not seen otherwise. And this is important because we know that when you do have a lesion or an abnormality on your MRI, those patients tend to do better when we're talking about surgical resection. Another one of the issues that comes up is about eloquent cortex. So this is kind of the medical term for saying, brain, regions of the brain that are important for function. So parts of your brain that are important in sensation, or parts of your brain that are important in speaking, or parts of your brain that are important in movement. And again, this is something that's taken very seriously anytime, we are undergoing a workup for epilepsy surgery. And so all of the testing is sort of geared towards understanding, number one, where the seizure is coming from and what is the risk of resecting that part of the brain. But what I can say is that, the testing that's done beforehand, as well as perhaps, during a session of intracranial monitoring, it allows us to map out areas of the brain that are involved in important functions, and, regions of essential function can be well delineated and protected during resection. And, the second part is, let's say that the epilepsy is in a part of eloquent cortex and an area of the brain that basically cannot be removed. Well, we know that there's still other options for the treatment of epilepsy, namely in those situations, the neuromodulation devices such as RNS, VNS, or DBS. One of the other, I don't want to say misconception, I think we have to be careful here, but, in terms of, can a patient with generalized or multifocal epilepsy still be a candidate for epilepsy surgery? So the reason I say you have to be careful, if an epilepsy is truly generalized, that means it's coming from your whole brain, or your whole brain kind of seizes at once. I mean, you would not be a candidate for epilepsy surgery. But what I want to caution is that sometimes what seems like a generalized epilepsy on an EEG, sometimes, when you work things up further, can be can be localized a little bit, or can be found to be coming from one side of the brain, or from, in best case, maybe one part of the brain. So, another thing we know is that people who have deep lesions or lesions at the midline, so lesions kind of in the middle part of your brain, deep inside, on the EEG, sometimes they, those findings or those discharges can look like they're coming from all over the brain, or they can look like they're coming from one side when they're not. So, have to be careful in terms of categorizing something as generalized. And it may be worth, for example, like I said, coming into an epilepsy center, having the seizures recorded to get the full picture in terms of whether the epilepsy is generalized, definitely generalized or not. In cases of truly drug-resistant generalized epilepsy, again, that's where we can consider some of our neuromodulation options, such as VNS, which has a pretty good responder rate, over time, generally greater than 50% seizure reduction, or nowadays DBS as well. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Psychiatric comorbidities, we know that, depression and epilepsy tend to run together a lot. Psychiatric comorbidity is not a contraindication to surgery, and that would be part of, again, an evaluation beforehand. And in all the literature that we have, psychiatric outcomes after epilepsy surgery, generally there are no changes or some improvements in psychiatric condition. So going back to our flow sheet, so we go to this first box here. So, what's going to happen when you're first referred to an epilepsy center? So like I said, you're going to be seen probably by an epilepsy specialist, and they're going to be looking at, okay, why are there still seizures going on? Is it an issue of not being able to take the medicine or not being able to tolerate the medicine because of side effects? And, at that point, they may look at switching you to a different medicine. Are the events clearly epilepsy, or have they been diagnosed? So they probably would want to, have the patient recorded in the epilepsy monitoring unit and have the seizures recorded to get a clear diagnosis of kind of the epilepsy type, and get an idea of where seizures are coming from. They may be able to identify, different treatable causes of seizures or sort of secondary causes of seizures. They may identify if there's, being on the wrong drug for the epilepsy type that you have, or perhaps not being on a high enough dosage or being on an incorrect dosage. And again, that's where sort of other options, sort of non-invasive, non-surgical, but other options for epilepsy treatment can be looked at, such as ketogenic diet or modified Atkins diet, as well as addressing lifestyle factors. If things are provoked by alcohol use, for example, or not sleeping well, or sleep apnea. All right, and so now we move to our pre-surgical box. So, this is where now, okay, we have a diagnosis. We're pretty clear that it's a focal epilepsy that's not responding to medicine. So this is where you're going to go under additional testing, and really mainly what most of the testing is getting at is trying to get the best idea we can beforehand of where seizures are coming from. So, typically that's going to involve the video EEG monitoring, probably trying to capture a handful of seizures, usually at least 3. And then brain imaging, you may need to repeat an MRI because, there's certain standards for MRI that are better for looking at epileptic lesions, such as focal cortical dysplasia or mesial temporal sclerosis. These are lesions in the temporal lobe that can cause epilepsy. As I said earlier, neuropsychology testing. Henry Ford offers MEG. So what MEG is, if you, keeping it simple, but if you take it back to your physics classes, if you think of a current, an electrical current is going to have an electrical field, and that's what an EEG measures. And but a current will also have a magnetic field, and that's what a MEG is measuring. And what's nice about it is that it's less affected by the scalp and skull, so it has a better spatial resolution than just EEG. So again, basically though, it's additional information in trying to localize where seizures are coming from. You may have a SPECT or PET scan. These are basically scans that are trying to assess metabolism in the brain, either during seizures or when you're not having seizures. And then some centers may do functional MRI or a WADA test. This is basically trying to identify which side of your brain is better or most responsible for language and memory. And that's going to help decide basically how language and memory might be affected in thinking about a resective surgery after all this testing is complete. And so, like I said, this process of getting all this testing, so forth, usually this would take around, on average, There may be special cases where it's kind of sped up, but generally speaking, kind of at least 6 months or so. And typically at that point, once we have that data, all of that pre-surgical testing, plus having captured your seizures, that's usually when we have kind of a multidisciplinary meeting with neurosurgeons, neuroradiologists, epileptologists, and everybody kind of sits and discusses the case and kind of sees where, what would be the best next steps, or what can be offered in terms of a resective surgery versus neuromodulation versus more testing. In a lot of cases, because all of these tests that we talked about in this category here, these are basically non-invasive tests, and other than the EEG monitoring, they're mostly occurring sort of on an outpatient basis. I think in a majority of cases, typically you need that next level of testing to really localize where seizures are coming from, and that's where intracranial monitoring comes in. So in a way, this is already a sort of type of diagnostic surgery, but not quite to the level of resection. And some patients who undergo this diagnostic monitoring may not end up being candidates for resection, but this is, again, all part of the workup. So, traditionally in the past, the way intracranial monitoring was done was with these grids and strips, and it's literally as you see here. So this is, a patient who's had a craniotomy. So, a portion of the skull has been taken out, and you're actually looking at the surface of the brain. And so this grid is actually laid onto the surface of the brain, and each of these circles represents an electrode that's recording basically the electrical data. And so what was nice about this is, you get a nice spatial resolution because you have a nice kind of big patch of recording. But as you can see, it's clearly invasive. It can be a bit more painful because it's involving basically taking a piece of your skull out. What's favored, more nowadays, I feel like, is stereo EEG. So this is where, we just make small incisions, and the EEG lead is actually stereotactically guided and inserted to reach, whatever kind of areas of the brain that we feel like we need to record from. And what's nice about this technique, number one, it's less invasive. Number two, it allows for exploration of deep focuses in the brain. So you can imagine, here you're looking at someone, again, this is just an X-ray basically, but, you're looking at someone head on, but you can see these leads are going very into deep focuses in the brain. You can imagine with the grids and strips, you're sort of limited to looking at the surface of the brain, which can be good if you think that's where the seizures are coming from. But if it's coming from a deeper focus, perhaps stereo EEG is better. And the other thing that's nice about this is it allows looking at both sides of the brain. So, you can't put a grid on both sides of the brain. It's too much. So this allows for bilateral exploration because, as we know, a lot of patients, even if all we've recorded are seizures coming from one side, a lot of times it turns out they're actually having seizures from both sides. So, all right. And then we get to our last box here. So we're kind of hitting on the different options for treatment of drug-resistant epilepsy. So we have, what's mentioned here, and I think I've got it more in our next slide. But so we're talking about resective surgery, laser ablation, and neuromodulatory devices, RNS, VNS, and deep brain stimulation. And then, so I'll be hitting on those a little bit more through some cases that we're going to go through. Resection is sort of the gold standard that everything is measured up against, but as we've seen with some of what I talked about before, not everyone is going to be a candidate for surgical resection. So let's go through a case. So 58-year-old woman presented with a history of childhood onset, frequent, highly stereotyped and brief nocturnal events characterized by sudden awakening from sleep with the feeling of being in a trance and having involuntary movements such as body rocking and grimacing, typically lasting 10 to 15 seconds and clustering over 1 to 2 hours nightly. Her seizures were highly medically refractory to trials of 10 different anti-epileptic drugs. So I can tell you, any like an epilepsy specialist who's listening to that history is already sort of attuned to the clinical characteristics of her seizures, and very typical of something that's coming more from the front of the brain. So let's take a look. So she had an MRI at an epilepsy center, and so this is like kind of a top down, kind of looking, if you were to look at someone's head from the top down, looking at a slice of the brain. And she has this area of kind of thickening here, or it's a little brighter. And these are some of the other, MRI sequences, kind of looking at it from different angles. But, basically, it represented, again, another, probably another focal cortical dysplasia. And then when you combine that information with, the clinical presentation of her seizures, it makes you start thinking, well, perhaps that's where her seizures are coming from. So she underwent a pre-surgical workup, and then she had a stereo EEG placement, and there was a depth electrode placed, directly into the lesion here. And, again, that's where you can see one of the advantages of stereo EEG, the ability to reach some deep focuses. And, basically it was found that her seizures were coming right from that MRI abnormality. And she underwent resective surgery, and, she was seizure free at a 2-year checkup. So, that's an example of stereo EEG and then going to a resective surgery. So we'll go to another case. So this is a 27-year-old right-handed woman was referred for an evaluation at an epilepsy center. She had a history of focal epilepsy since age 24, and her seizures were described as feeling cold, chilly, and scary, followed by staring with unresponsiveness and lips backing. Despite being on 3 anti-epileptic drugs, she continued to have 1 to 3 focal seizures with impaired awareness per month. She reported having a depressed mood. I think the only reason to bring that up is just to say that, we still frequently see depression in cases of epilepsy, and it's not a contraindication to thinking about surgery. So she too underwent an MRI, and again, this is one of the head-on images. So looking like, straight ahead, if you were looking straight ahead at a person and kind of taking a slice of the brain, basically. So this is the right side, this is the left side. And, if you look carefully, there's a little abnormality here, sort of a heterotopia is what the medical term, but can be thought of kind of along the same lines as a focal cortical dysplasia. So basically an abnormality of the development or sort of extra tissue in the brain that's causing seizures. So she underwent, the typical testing, and then she also had a stereo EEG placement. And so she had a depth electrode, again, that was placed right into the area of this abnormality. And this is actually an EEG representation of her depth electrode. So each one of these is representing one of the depth electrodes. So, one here, one here, one here, one here, one here, one here. And then each of the individual ones are like electrodes in that line that are being compared to each other. So this is the depth electrode that was in the heterotopia. And, when they recorded her seizures, basically the first, electrographic changes were sort of within the heterotopia, as well as kind of the left hippocampus, one of the structures in the temporal lobe. So for her, it was felt that, it was a deep focus. She's a younger woman, to maybe take a less invasive approach. So she underwent laser ablation. And so she had a laser ablation of the heterotopia and the mesial temporal structures such as the hippocampus. And she was seizure-free at a 1-year checkup. And this just kind of leads into a short discussion about thermal ablation. So this is one of the new techniques that we have for epilepsy surgery. And again, what's nice about it, it's a minimally invasive approach, so you don't require craniotomy. A piece of the skull does not have to come out. It's very focused, so you're really going after targeted areas or targeted lesions that you think are involved in seizures. And what's nice about that is sort of one of the limitations of a resective surgery anyway, is that, when you're talking about deep focus, or focus that's deep in the brain, you may, inadvertently sort of affect tissue that you didn't want to, because, there's no other way to reach it. So it's thought that, again, because it's so targeted, that it probably has a positive impact on memory and naming and that sort of function afterwards, because again, you're taking sort of as little out as possible. And usually it's pretty short. I mean, you only have to be in the hospital for 24 hours or so. And what's nice about it is basically you can see where, we talked about before, there's so many barriers already to epilepsy surgery, that having something that's a little less invasive that can make you seizure free is not a bad thought, and may kind of entice more people into going down the epilepsy surgery pathway. The limitation with it is that it is thought to be perhaps slightly not as effective as resective surgery. But, the nice thing about it is, even if you fail that once, you can still come back and undergo a resective surgery if needed. So, I think we'll be seeing it kind of more and more in the future. All right, so we'll go to a third case now. So this is a 37-year-old right-handed man with a history of drug-resistant epilepsy since the age of 2. He was referred to an epilepsy center. His seizure started without an aura, and witnesses had described that he repeated phrases like "go, go, go," became confused, and sometimes walked into a corner of the room. Despite being on 2 anti-epileptic drugs, he had 1 bilateral tonic-clonic seizure per month. He was depressed. So, you can imagine he's being referred at 37. So, he's already been dealing with seizures for like 35 years of his life. So that kind of illustrates that 20-year gap that we often see. So he underwent basically the typical workup as we talked about. He had MRI, video EEG monitoring, all of those things. So what the video EEG monitoring had shown is basically that he had seizures coming from both sides. So he had seizures coming from the left hemisphere, he had seizures coming from the right hemisphere. And that basically limits the ability to go for surgical resection, because you can't take out basically both focuses, or you can't do surgery on both sides, because it might have bad effects on your memory or otherwise. So he's not a candidate for resective surgery. So he was thought to be a good candidate for RNS, or responsive neurostimulation. So this is one of the newer, I should say, neuromodulation devices. And what this is basically the device actually sits inside of your skull here, and there are electrodes that are going out to where we think the seizures are coming from, and you can actually connect up to 4, but only 2 of them are active. And what I mean by active is that excuse me, they're always recording. So they're actually recording the data. It's almost like a live EEG that's going on all the time. But when they sense a seizure, they give a little stimulation and they stop the seizure. And that's actually what's being illustrated in this box here, is that there was a seizure coming on, there was a stimulation, and basically the seizures stopped. But what's nice about this, so what's these other boxes are basically demonstrating seizures that were detected on the RNS. So, this is always recording, and this is a seizure on the left, and this is a seizure on the right. So for this patient, what ended up happening is that, so the RNS was recording data over the course of the year. He was following up in the clinic. And what it found is that basically he had 30 or so seizures coming from the left side and 2 seizures coming from the right side. So clearly most of his seizures were coming from the left, and they actually switched the active electrode from, so initially it was stimulating, on the left and the right, and they changed it to stimulating both on the left. So that's the nice feature about RNS, is that it gives you time to record data, in particular in these cases when seizures are coming from both sides, because what we know is, especially when you have bilateral seizure focuses, the time spent, in the EMU or, doing video EEG monitoring doesn't often, in those 10 days or let's say up to 14 days, doesn't paint an accurate picture exactly of how many seizures are coming from which side, in ordinary settings, in particular like when you're on your medicines and so forth. So just going over briefly the different neuromodulation options. So we talked a little bit about responsive neurostimulation. I would think of it mainly for people who are not candidates for resective surgery and have, basically if you don't have more than 2 seizure focuses, that's where RNS is pretty good. The thing to keep in mind though is that we have to have a good idea of where the seizures are coming from. So, RNS tends to fail if you just kind of are experimentally putting the leads in and you are not very certain that that's where the seizures are starting. Vagus nerve stimulation has been out there for a while, still very effective for people with refractory generalized epilepsy. The newer models have a cardiac detection system, so that basically it's sensing your heart rate, and when your heart rate increases, it automatically gives a stimulation. But generally speaking, with VNS, we do see sort of a 50% reduction in seizure frequency. The odds of become seizure free on it are low, and to be honest, that probably goes for the rest of these neuromodulation devices as well. Definitely can improve seizures and decrease seizure frequency, what we're looking for, but probably would not make you seizure free, generally speaking. And then the newest device is the deep brain stimulation. So this was recently approved by the FDA, and it's actually been around in other countries for a while. And you may have heard of it in the context of Parkinson's disease, but what the key trial, the Sante trials, showed that it's actually pretty effective for seizures as well. In particular, at least in that study, it was mostly seizures coming from the temporal lobe, or at least with the temporal lobe involved in the seizure network. I think probably more research is needed into figuring out how good it can be, like with different stimulation. So that study, stimulated in the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, but there have been other studies kind of testing out stimulating in different parts of the brain with different success for different seizure types. So I think a little more research is needed to see how successful we can get that, but it's another option. So if you've failed VNS already, DBS now is an option. Other things to think about, VNS and DBS in general would be more for people for whom it is difficult to localize. For after all the testing, it was just difficult to localize exactly where seizures are coming from. They would be better candidates for VNS and DBS. All right, so we go back to our flow chart. So again, I think probably the keys to emphasize are basically, don't wait after, failing that second seizure medicine. Once you failed that second seizure medicine, you can be right in that pathway to figuring out if you're a candidate for epilepsy surgery. and again, this is not sort of a monolithic thing that everybody's going to get this, then this, then this. It's sort of, you start here, you get a workup, and you try to figure out what the best thing you can do for each patient is. But, not everyone's going to be a candidate for resective surgery, but it's worth looking into because we know that uncontrolled seizures is dangerous to your health. So I'll just conclude basically, again, kind of focusing on some take-home points. So 1/3 of all patients are drug resistant, and we know that drug-resistant epilepsy is a life-threatening disorder. We know that epilepsy surgery is a very important and effective tool in treating drug-resistant epilepsy, and so any patient who has failed 2 AEDs should be referred to an epilepsy center. And as we've seen, early identification is something we're not doing very well, but is very key in terms of getting people timely referral to a comprehensive epilepsy center. So with that, I'll conclude, and we can take questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Yousuf, for a really thorough and enlightening presentation. We do have some questions coming in, so I will get to those right now. Someone asked about the difference between VNS and DBS, and I know you discussed that. Maybe to add to that question, what would be maybe the distinction between the deep brain stimulator and because I know the RNS can have depth electrodes. So what would be the distinction between DBS and having an RNS with the depth electrodes put into the anterior nucleus of the thalamus?
RNS is different from the DBS and the VNS, mainly because it's actually, what we called sort of like an open loop recording. So it's actually, sensing when you have seizures and then only stimulating when you have seizures. VNS and DBS are more, you could think of them as kind of nearly continuously on. They're not really, the VNS to some extent nowadays with the cardiac detection, but generally speaking, they're just kind of constantly stimulating. So they're always on. They're not really sensing, whether you're having seizures or not. In terms of effectiveness, I think DBS and there's not much head-to-head between all of these yet. But kind of anecdotally, I feel like RNS and DBS are sort of roughly similar in terms of their effectiveness. The key is going to be for RNS is having a localization where you can put in the electrodes. So like, in someone who we don't exactly know where, if we have an idea that maybe the temporal lobe is involved, but we don't know exactly where, probably DBS might be a better fit for a patient like that. But, if you know where the seizures are coming from, perhaps RNS, but those are very kind of nuanced discussions that we have that even we don't know exactly what the correct answer is yet.
Right. And in reference to the original question about the difference between VNS and DBS, can you think of a specific example, for example, where someone might choose DBS over VNS because DBS is a slightly more invasive surgery, but is there a particular advantage of DBS
I think
over VNS?
Generally speaking, right now, like in terms of our practice, for a truly generalized epilepsy, probably VNS would come first. There are some studies of DBS in generalized epilepsy, but I don't think it's very well understood yet. So I think in a generalized epilepsy that's refractory, typically would favor VNS first. Okay.
All right, so another question. My son had only one seizure and has been diagnosed with generalized epilepsy. My son's MRI was remarkable, and there was an issue with dental artifacts showing. The video EEG did not capture a seizure, but showed significant epileptic activity. He's on levetiracetam, and so far so good. In this case, would this be a situation to visit an epilepsy center and explore further? Or is it sounds to me like it's if the Keppra or levetiracetam is working well, may not be necessary, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yep, exactly. So sounds like the epilepsy is controlled on the first medicine, and we talked about that. Basically, 60 to 80% would be controlled on a medicine. In terms of the epilepsy type, I know I mentioned earlier about not all generalized epilepsies may not be clearly generalized, but again, we have to be careful. Especially, there are lots of different epilepsy syndromes and generalized epilepsy syndromes, particularly in childhood. So, it may be very well that he fits into one of the typical kind of childhood syndromes, and his EEG had the typical markers of that. They put him on a good broad spectrum medicine, and now his seizures are controlled. So, if seizures are controlled, I don't think, you don't have to go any further.
Okay. So another person was recommended to have the RNS, and they're asking about the negative side effects. So maybe talk about possible complications versus potential side effects. As far as I know, there's not really much in the way of like ongoing side effects, but
yeah, exactly, correct. Yeah, I think it's a little bit more invasive, than some of the other options. So I don't know of any like clearly attributable side effects like just to the RNS. It is a little bit more involved in terms of, generally speaking, it might take someone who at least has the social support or is higher functioning themselves to actually upload the data. So, as I said, the RNS is always recording all the time, but it's sort of up to the patient to go in and upload things to the computer and things like that. So from that standpoint, it can be a little bit more technical, than the other things that are just kind of on all the time. But yeah, I don't have any like sort of standout that, it's sort of patient to patient, but nothing clear about RNS.
Okay. So another person asked about the difference between abnormal brain waves before REM sleep versus epilepsy.
Well, I'm not sure what we're getting at there exactly, but we do. What we see is that a lot of the abnormalities that come between seizures, or what we call interictal abnormalities, they often come out in sleep or in deep sleep. That could include REM sleep, but nothing about, if the abnormality was seen, nothing would change about whether it was seen in that stage of sleep or otherwise.
Right. So maybe to build on that, what are some, I guess, distinctions between EEG abnormalities and epileptiform abnormalities specifically?
To me, I would look at them as kind of similar,
Okay.
but I guess, it would be really parsing phrases here, but epileptiform is basically saying that discharges that we're seeing in between there is sort of electrical irritability there. So there is a chance basically that you're going to have seizures, or you're at risk for seizures. Generally speaking, folks who have those are on a seizure medicine. Your EEG can have other abnormalities that don't necessarily give any risk to seizures, or they're not diagnostic in terms of seizures. They may be showing sort of asymmetries in structure with the brain or slowing in certain areas, but those are not specific to epilepsy. So basically, from your question, epileptiform would refer to something that increases your risk of seizures.
Okay, great. So can you talk a little bit more about SPECT injections to help localize seizures, and just briefly tell a little bit more about that procedure?
Yeah. So SPECT is a really nice tool when done, when it's able to be done correctly. Basically, it's using a nuclear tracer, similar to like a PET scan, basically. And what is happening is that you have your seizure, and the tracer is injected. And then you have a CAT scan afterwards, and basically we can see which areas of the brain are hypermetabolic or using more energy at the time of your seizure. So it's a nice tool when we don't really know where seizures are starting to kind of help guide us as to where seizures might be coming from. What it involves typically is it's another basically time in the epilepsy monitoring unit. So you come into the epilepsy monitoring unit, your medicines will be reduced, and we'll try to capture seizures. But what's different about this is that the tracer will be injected, and you'll have the scan afterwards. The tricky parts of it are that for most places, you have to have your seizure between like 8 and 3, like business hours, which we know epilepsy doesn't work on business hours. So that's one of the tricky balances with getting a SPECT. And then the other thing is, getting the SPECT injection at the right time, because if the injection happens much later, then you're not really seeing the changes at the beginning.
Okay, great. Is the treatment different for an individual who's had a traumatic brain injury and seizures beginning 6 years later? So post-traumatic epilepsy, I guess, how does that impact maybe how well you would be, or how good a candidate you might be for some of these other treatment options?
I think it, depending on the level of injury, it can affect sort of what can be done surgically. So if that area of the brain is already significantly injured, it may be difficult to perform a resection. That being said, I still think, if seizures are refractory, it's still working up like at an epilepsy center, so that you get the best idea of whether, okay, if you're not a candidate for resection, maybe you would be a candidate for RNS or something else. So you could still be a candidate for other treatments for epilepsy, but perhaps resection may be a little more complicated depending on the level of injury.
Okay. So what about patients who are not drug resistant? They have good seizure control, but the side effects from the medications are very impactful. Someone feeling really heavy or sluggish, is a non-pharmacological approach worth pursuing in this type of patient?
That's a tough one. I mean, generally speaking, if the seizures are controlled on medicine, most I think epileptologists would favor trying to find you the right medicine. So, treating epilepsy is all about a balance between controlling seizures and side effects of medicine. We don't want your quality of life to suffer from medicines. Sometimes I think I'm not sure everyone always knows all the options for the medicines. There are extended release forms of medicines that can be better tolerated. So, I mean, generally speaking, because epilepsy surgery is even though I've presented it in a way that it's sort of safer, but, at the end of the day, we're still talking about a procedure and all that. Generally speaking, if your seizures are controlled by medicine, most people would like to keep it that way. But again, that's where, though it may not, it may be worth, again, at least going to an epilepsy center to see if they have something else to offer in terms of medicines.
Right. And then another thing that may be considered would be something along the lines of the modified Atkins diet or some variation of the ketogenic diet that might allow you to get some additional seizure control and possibly reduce the dosage of those medications so that the side effects are less. So that could be another thing that could be considered.
Definitely.
Okay. We have time for about one more question. I know there's a few that we may not get to, but what is the expected amount of time to see positive results in seizure reduction with the RNS?
It can take some time. I think that's probably what one of the issues has been in terms of people's experiences with the RNS and having negative experiences with the RNS. It's so dependent on number one, that the electrodes are in the right place. So, if they're not sensing where seizures are starting, there's a chance that RNS would not be very effective. But if everything is in the right place and things are going well, each time you come to the office, basically the settings are kind of tweaked to better sense the seizures or kind of increased stimulation. So over a period of years, I think it gets better. So it's hard to say when you'll see the benefit right away. Some people, just by virtue of like the implantation, see their seizures kind of cut down. Some people don't. So, it could take a year, could take, couple of years. What we know from the studies is that over like a 7-year period, we've seen sort of a 50 to 60% reduction in seizure frequency.
Yep. And we see also with VNS a similar improvement over time. So
Right.
It's a good thing to keep in mind for both of those treatments. All right, well, we are at 7 o'clock, so I want to thank you so much, Dr. Yousuf, for a very thorough and fascinating discussion, and really enjoyed all of the case studies that you provided as well. For our next presentation, we're thrilled to have Dr. Nancy McNamara, who's a pediatric epileptologist from Michigan Medicine's CS Mott Children's Hospital, and she will be presenting on the genetics of epilepsy. I know this is a very rapidly growing field, so we're excited to learn more. So Dr. McNamara, if you could share your, there you go, and share your screen, and we'll be all set.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. I'm very honored to speak at this conference today. Can you see my screen, Russ? Just want to make sure.
Yes, all set.
Okay, great, thank you. So like Russ was saying, I take care of patients at the University of Michigan. I think that I have the best job in the whole world and work with some of the best people on the planet. I also have had the privilege of working with Dr. Yousuf. He was a trainee at the University of Michigan just a couple of years ago. And it's an honor to go after him. There are 9 of us in pediatric epilepsy at the University of Michigan, a number that's growing every year. And a total of 17 of us in pediatric neurology. I'd say importantly, I listened to Hailey and saw a lot of myself in her, other than she's much more positive than I was at that age. I identify both as a pediatric epilepsy doctor, but also as a sibling of somebody with refractory epilepsy. And so that hit close to home. So most talks by academic physicians have disclosures, of which mine I don't think are relevant, but I have earned a total of $100 by writing articles about febrile seizures for MedLink. And I think an important disclaimer is that I'm not a geneticist, but I do frequently order genetic testing on my patients with epilepsy. So I mainly want to give you an overall framework in which to think about genetic testing in pediatric epilepsy. There's no way to do a thoroughly comprehensive talk about this in an hour. So I mainly just want to give some framework. I'm going to talk about why genetic testing is done in people with epilepsy, primarily focusing on pediatric patients, since that's typically when it's done in the patients that I see. I'm also going to give a background on primarily 3 types of genetic testing that's done. And honestly, most places you walk into, 90% of the time, that's what's going to be done, or one of these 3 tests. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll give some understanding as to why it might be important for your child or for yourself, and how management may change dramatically. So I just went through kind of 3 illustrative cases that I thought were quite relevant for this talk. Dr. Yousuf talked about this a little bit, but just to get us on the same page, because some people in this audience may have been dealing with epilepsy for 35 years and other people for just, a few months. But epilepsy is the tendency for somebody to have seizures. And there are 2 definitions that are recognized. One is when somebody has 2 or more unprovoked seizures. But additionally, if somebody has a seizure and based on their probability of having a second seizure, if it's greater than 50% as assessed by a neurologist or a physician, they may also have the diagnosis of epilepsy. And sometimes the diagnosis of epilepsy or the cause of somebody's epilepsy is quite obvious. So a child who had a traumatic brain injury at the time of birth, or a hypoxic ischemic injury, or was in a car accident, or has a brain tumor, those are all reasons why a brain can have seizures. But there's a large subset of patients where the diagnosis was not known. So here's a pie chart from the 1970s, which was actually not that long ago. And what you can see in the about 1/4 of this pie chart are the causes of epilepsy, or what were thought to be the causes of epilepsy at the time. So obvious things like trauma, stroke, neoplasm, which is a tumor, an infectious cause like meningitis or encephalitis, a congenital lesion or a birth injury like anoxia, or there was 75% of this pie is idiopathic. I remember when I got into medicine being kind of confused what idiopathic means, but idiopathic means we don't know the answer. And this pie chart was fairly recently upgraded to filling in just a couple more pieces of the pie. So people still have seizures because of trauma and strokes and tumors and meningitis and encephalitis. Autoimmune causes are a more recognized cause of epilepsy and seizures nowadays. But then that maybe now less than 75% of the pie has gotten a little bit smaller, and basically don't worry about all the little words, but basically genetic causes of epilepsy. Sometimes these are relatively straightforward. Everybody in the family has seizures, or sometimes it's more complex, or just in that person. And this was from 6 years ago. So now it's kind of an old pie chart in the world of genetics. Thinking a little bit about the history of genetics and epilepsy, and kind of showing, I would say, our limitations and where we've come in a pretty short period of time. But in the 1940s and 50s, some really, really smart epilepsy doctors did what we call like twin studies, and they found that a specific kind of epilepsy, childhood absence epilepsy, was seen more frequently in identical twins, and sort of made people start to think about the genetic causes of epilepsy, or how about documented it a little bit better and did a more rigorous study. And then it wasn't until 1994, 1995 that the first epilepsy gene was discovered. And that was pretty incredible. But that was not actually all that long ago either. That was well after I was born. And this gene, it doesn't matter unless you have it, but it is related to having seizures and sleep. That's genetically inherited, called autosomal dominant nocturnal frontal lobe epilepsy. And then in the 1990s and early 2000s, a whole bunch more genes were found to be associated with epilepsy. So this is around the time of the whole genome project, where genetics has just like exploded, right, since the 1990s. And a whole bunch of genes were found. Most of these genes, some of you in the audience might be familiar with, but many of these are associated with some pretty devastating epilepsies, called Dravet syndrome, and other ones less devastating as well. Also, CDKL5 is Rett syndrome, so quite a few. And then look at this incomplete chart, because it only goes up to like 2015. And now there's just tons of genes that have been found associated with epilepsy. Honestly, it's like every couple of weeks or every month, like we're finding more stuff, because there's just, for multiple reasons. One is the cost of genetic testing has come down. Secondly, the ways that genetic testing is done has just gotten better and faster, and we're just able to do more. So we're learning so much. So, but I think we have to do a little bit of Bio 101, and I tested this all out on my husband, who is not a physician, who's an engineer, to make sure that this made sense, because you can't really go too far into genetic testing without a little bit of a primer. So I am sorry if this is overly basic for anyone, but each child gets 50% of their DNA from their mother and 50% of their DNA from their father. And it's not like a straight thing. There's a bunch of mixing up in there of the genes and crossing over. And importantly, I mean, I'm always amazed at like a newborn baby, a child who's made, like there's just so many things that have to happen. And very importantly, in all of us, there are changes in our DNA that we didn't get from our mom or from our dad, because of the crossing over and the copying of DNA as a child is being formed. And there's actually a whole bunch of mistakes that are made. Like all of us have lots of mistakes in our DNA, and it doesn't mean that somebody did something wrong. It's just that's the way it goes. our bodies are amazing and they fix the vast majority of these mistakes. And we all have like a bit of a barrier in that we can absorb a lot of these mistakes and they don't matter. But sometimes they do, and sometimes it only takes one change in a DNA to really change somebody's life, and to give them what we call like a genetic mutation that could cause something like epilepsy or a heart defect or something like that. Every single one of our cells has our own unique DNA in it, right? 50% that we got from our parents, 50% from mom, 50% from dad. We each have 23 pairs of chromosomes, as you can see here. To remind you, a chromosome is made up of a bunch of genes, and they're all like kind of like wound together and packed in there. And each gene is a group of DNA. So just remember this as we keep talking. So each cell has all of our chromosomes in it. The chromosomes are made up of a bunch of genes. And the gene is a group of DNA that goes to do something. And the DNA or the gene is transcribed into RNA, which we can just sort of gloss over in our heads right now. You don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of that. And then that's transcribed into the protein. And the protein's the functional thing in our body. The DNA is what we test nowadays in 2020. But what actually matters, or what actually could cause the epilepsy, for example, is the protein, which is the product of the DNA. So I think that's an important concept just to keep in your head. So let's talk a little bit about the genetic testing that's done now that you've got the little bio 101. Who do we test? First of all, I would say I've been practicing pediatric neurology for about 10 years now. I have not been out of training for 10 years, but as part of my training. And this is so different just in the past 10 years. So initially we would only test on rare occasions. But now, and over the last, I'd say 3 years or so, it's basically anybody with epilepsy who walks to my door and the etiology is not clear. So the cause is not clear. So the child didn't have an anoxic brain injury. The child doesn't have a malformation in their brain or something obvious, then I typically do genetic testing, as do my colleagues as well. There are a couple of exceptions to this. So there are some benign epilepsy syndromes where a child, it's sort of like, I don't care what the genetics are because it's so common and you're probably going to grow out of it. Right now, we don't tend to do genetic testing unless there's something a little bit off with it, because even if we did it, it wouldn't kind of change management. I think you could argue with me on this one and I would do the genetic testing, but there are a few instances where we tend to not do genetic testing. So basically anybody who walks in my door with epilepsy who I don't know the cause. So how do we test? So these are the three main high yield tests that we do for pediatric epilepsy. And one of the pediatric epilepsy experts who I'm very good friends with, Dr. Dang, and I actually had a long discussion as I was putting together this talk about like, which test do you do first and whatever. You can debate about this all day, but I would say in general, most people progress in this level of doing genetic testing. So we do something called a chromosomal microarray, then an epilepsy gene panel, then something called whole exome sequencing. And I'll go into depth about each one of these and what they mean and why we do them. As my engineering husband said, he said, it sounds like the chromosomal microarray is kind of like a big high level overview of somebody's DNA. When that's true, you're looking for any big extra pieces or missing pieces or extra chromosomes. An epilepsy gene panel, you're sort of going through somebody's DNA and you're going for like the top hitters, like the classic genes associated with epilepsy, and you're looking to see if there's any changes in that person's DNA. And then whole exome sequencing is much more detailed. You're looking at all of their coding DNA. So chromosomal microarray, I'm a very visual person. I think it has to do with me being an epilepsy doctor and wanting to read brainwaves all the time. So chromosomal microarray is like it's like spilling open the guts of somebody's DNA and like looking at their chromosomes, because remember the chromosomes are like big chunks of DNA, and you're looking to see if there's any extra pieces or missing pieces. In this one that I pulled from Google, you can see that this person has an extra chromosome 20, which could account for, you know, some features that this child has. This costs, it's always like amazing how much things actually cost in medicine, but this costs only about $1,500, and it takes anywhere between 1 and 3 weeks to get the results back. So in my world, $1,500 doesn't seem like so much, but it would be if this was out of pocket. And fortunately now in 2020, almost all insurances cover it, or sometimes I have to write a specific letter to get this covered. But this is a test I order on an almost daily basis. An epilepsy gene panel, what this is, and again, don't read the fine print. The point is that you're testing some number of top hitter genes related to epilepsy that we know that are actually, like, we're adding to this on a daily basis. So the one that I commonly use has around 140 or 150 genes that are tested, and what the company does is that it actually looks at the DNA in all of these genes, and they even have an option of going up to about 200 genes if I want them. Oftentimes, sometimes this will give me the answer, like it comes back and it pops up and I say, oh yeah, like that fits with the kid, you know, but very frequently the results can be ambiguous, and I'll show you an example of that in the case. And we have to test the parents to see if the parents also have that change in their DNA. Because if a child has a change in a DNA in epilepsy, but the dad has it too, but doesn't have epilepsy, then that's probably not the cause. So even if it's in a gene associated with epilepsy, that may not be the cause. And that's a really important thing. So each time, it's like my job never gets boring. I never get bored because when I get results like this back, I always have to think about, like, what does this mean in the context of this child and their epilepsy? This takes about 2 to 4 weeks to come back. What's cool about this test is that this one doesn't have to be blood, and it can actually be a spit test. So the child oftentimes will get a kit in the mail and they just like spit into a tube, which sounds kind of gross, but it's better than, for some kids, than getting a blood draw. And then it comes back in a couple of weeks, maybe a month or so. It costs about $3,000 to $4,000, and actually this one's quite commonly, even more so than a chromosomal microarray, covered by insurance, which is really nice, because I'll explain why this may be very important to a child. And then whole exome sequencing, it's just amazing that we can even do this. So 10 years ago, like, this was only done on a research basis because it cost something like $50,000. But now, like, especially the children that I take care of who have a refractory epilepsy, if I don't find the answer in the chromosomal microarray or the epilepsy gene panel, now I can send them to a geneticist to get whole exome sequencing. This is a test that most pediatric neurologists do not send off themselves, because it's not just looking at epilepsy related genes, it's actually looking at all of that child's coding DNA. And that is kind of a big thing to do in somebody who is not a consenting adult, right? So, because you could find things completely irrelevant to their epilepsy, but maybe very important to that child's future and their health. So for example, the common example always given is, what if you are looking for the cause of their epilepsy, but you find that they're a carrier of the BRCA1 gene and mutation, and that means they're going to develop breast cancer. Well, you need to have the discussion before you get that answer back about whether or not you're going to disclose that to the child. Does that family want to know that or not? Or will they want to know that when the child is 18 and an adult? So for this one, most of us don't feel it's ethically appropriate for us to send off whole exome sequencing unless the child and the family are visited by a genetic counselor first. And most pediatric neurologists don't have this in their clinic, and we have to send the patients to genetic counselors. But it's worth the time, given the potential implications. It's unbelievable how cheap this has become. So it's actually closer to 3 months to get the results back instead of 6 months. But I just put that in there because I think it's important to know that sometimes it takes a little bit longer than 3 months. And the main cost of whole exome sequencing, I was surprised by, was is actually in the interpretation of the results. So it actually, the test itself is actually not all that expensive to run, but it's the interpretation of the results that get you to the 5,000 to 7,000 mark. And again, when it's done in the appropriate clinical context, and again, with epilepsy, especially intractable epilepsy, it's typically covered by insurance or with a very low copay. So what is the yield for genetic testing? The stats for this are like a little bit all over the place, but in general, believe it or not, chromosomal microarray, which is the thing that most of us send off first, it has the lowest likelihood of finding the cause. But what I was always taught is that you could miss things if you just skip over that. But it's worth doing because about 5 to 10% of the time you'll find the cause of somebody's epilepsy. The epilepsy gene panel has a much higher likelihood of finding the cause. So about 15 to 50% of the time you'll find the cause. And then whole exome sequencing, which is that, much more detailed look at somebody's DNA, has about a 28 to 38% chance of finding the cause. Overall, this is where like the stats are a little funny. Overall, you have about a 20 to 30% chance of finding somebody's genetic cause of their epilepsy by doing these 3 tests. And your likelihood of finding a cause is higher. Let's say the child has developmental delay or problems with their heart also, or problems with their kidneys or something like that, or even a brain malformation, your likelihood of finding a genetic cause is higher. So kind of my general approach to all children, I always say this to like trainees, the vast majority of my job is taking a history. And that is true when it comes to when I'm thinking about it, the whole child, and thinking about the possible cause of their epilepsy, specifically when I'm worried about genetic cause. So sometimes, so if I'm thinking about a child and their seizure started when they were 1 month versus 10 years of age, there's a completely different set of genetic syndromes, and if the seizure started in infancy versus as a preteen. Are the seizures short or are they long? Do they involve one part of the body or are they all over? The seizures primarily at night or during the day, or are the seizures provoked by a febrile illness or a fever? These all kind of change an epileptologist's thought as to what could be the genetic cause and kind of where to go. So let me give you 3 examples, and I've changed the specifics, so hopefully nobody has any identifying features of these kids, because there is actually a conglomeration of several kids. But they're similar enough, all 3 cases, what you'll see is that they're kind of redundant and they're pretty similar, and they all have very dramatically different genetic causes of their epilepsy. So we'll start with Ben. Ben is a 4-year-old boy, and he has intractable epilepsy. So intractable epilepsy, again, is when you have seizures despite having tried 2 medications. And in fact, Ben, not only does he have intractable epilepsy, but he has daily seizures, and he has since he was a tiny baby. They tend to happen when he has a fever or if there's a change in his routine or schedule. I didn't put this in here, but his brain MRI is totally normal. There's no family history of epilepsy, and the parents have always wondered, why does my child have seizures? Other important things is that Ben doesn't walk or talk, but he smiles in response to his parents, so he's globally delayed in all domains as well. And he seems to have more regression when he has a little longer seizures as well. He's on 2 medications, and he's on dietary therapy in the form of the ketogenic diet. So they came to me to say, what next? What can we do next for our child? So in thinking about what to do next and all of the medications that he's been on before and the ketogenic diet, we embarked on some genetic testing. And so his chromosomal microarray, it was normal. So again, that was the first test, the lowest likelihood of being positive, but it was normal. Next, we did an epilepsy gene panel, and believe it or not, we found a likely cause, or actually the cause. So he had what's called a mutation or a change in his DNA, and it's been described in other people as disease causing. in a gene called the SCN1A gene, which is a sodium channel gene. And this fit very much with this child's epilepsy. So in this kind of epilepsy, which is also called Dravet syndrome, children have seizures from infancy, oftentimes convulsive, prolonged seizures. They can have other kinds of seizures that come on over time, including absent seizures and myoclonic seizures. And why this is important is it doesn't just give this child a name to his epilepsy, because that was actually really important for this family. But very importantly, we know, because there's enough people with this kind of epilepsy, that people with epilepsy from this type of sodium channel mutation have worsened seizures if they use a certain type of anti-seizure medicine referred to as sodium channel blockers. And this is a very common form of anti-seizure medication that we use in infants and in adults, but specifically when you have this gene mutation, you should not use it. Actually, it's a contraindication, or say like don't use it at all. And why this is also important is because there are very specialized medications that we can use for this type of epilepsy. And that was something that you would not know, and you would not be able to use those medications unless we had the genetic cause. So in Ben's case, he had Dravet syndrome or SCN1A mutation, and it really guided our management and our treatment. Let me go to case number 2. So this is Joe. Again, if the story sounds similar, it was not done on purpose. So Joe is a 4-year-old boy. He also has intractable epilepsy. He's had seizures since infancy, and he has them almost on a daily basis. They tend to also happen when he has a fever or changes in routine. There's nobody in the family with epilepsy. So the family has always struggled and wanted to know what the cause of their child's epilepsy was. Other important things is that Joe does not walk or talk. He never has, but he smiles in response to his parents. And every year you can sort of like, he progresses at his own rate. So he has new things that he does every year, but is definitely delayed in comparison to his peers. He's on 2 medications as well as dietary therapy in the form of the ketogenic diet. And they come and they say, what are we going to do next? So he already had a chromosomal microarray when I met him. At the time when he was a baby, people were not doing epilepsy gene panels. It was just cost prohibitive and not even a thing then. But by the time I met him, it was just starting to become a thing that we were able to do and get approved. So we sent off his epilepsy gene panel. And lo and behold, we got a hit. So he had a change in his DNA. And the change in the DNA, when they don't know if it's a mutation or not, it's listed as something called a VUS, or a variant of unknown significance, in a sodium channel gene, but different than the last kid. So the last kid had a change in his DNA in the SCN1A gene. This kid had a change in his DNA in the SCN8A gene, which I would say to almost everyone in the room, you might say, well, those sound like the same thing, but they're not. And that's the point here. So, but when somebody gets a result back, I can't just presume it's the cause unless it's like something that's been described before. This child had this VUS, and so this change in his DNA. We looked at it in comparison to a whole bunch of other people's DNA. So there are all these like what we call population databases where like very healthy people donate their DNA so that you can compare it. And what you do is you look and see, do other people have the same change in their DNA? Because if they do, then it might mean something that like, it might not mean anything, because it means that those other people have that change and they're fine. But when we ran this, we didn't find it at all in the hundreds of thousands of people who donated their DNA to these databases. So that's a red flag to us that maybe this is contributory to this kid's epilepsy. We tested his parents, neither of whom have epilepsy, and neither of them had the same change. So we know that they did not pass it on to this child. And then we do something called predictive modeling, which was me calling my researcher friends to say, hey, like if there was this change in this kid's DNA here, would it affect, remember, like the protein? Like would it affect like the protein that was made? And they said, yes, actually, if you had this change in this part of this DNA for the sodium channel, then yes, it actually would change the folding. So just to remind you of this picture on the right, so the DNA encodes the protein. And so his variant was upgraded to a pathogenic mutation. And so then I got back on the phone with my researcher friends who happen to be at University of Michigan, who do all the research on this gene. And why this is so important is because they had just figured out that people with this kind of epilepsy, it's the opposite of Ben. With Joe's kind of epilepsy, they actually should go on sodium channel blockers, and actually high dose sodium channel blockers. Children with this kind of epilepsy or people with this kind of epilepsy do much, much better on that. And this is not something that I would have been able to tell if Joe and Ben were right next to each other. Their stories sounded exactly the same. They looked exactly the same. I never would have known had we not done the epilepsy gene panel. So this was huge for this child. And then a third example, I just changed the details a little bit, was Alex. So Alex is a 2-year-old boy, so a little bit younger. He kept coming into the hospital because since infancy, anytime he had a fever or a change in his schedule or his routine or missed a dose of medicine, he would have a prolonged seizure and come to the hospital and have to be intubated to get his seizures to stop. And there was no family history of epilepsy. He had made a few more developmental milestones than Joe and Ben. He was able to walk, maybe had a couple words, but like not really. And if anything, his parents thought he was actually regressing, especially when he had prolonged seizures. He was on 2 anti-seizure medications and he was on dietary therapy. So gosh, what are we gonna do for Alex? So same kind of thing, did a chromosomal microarray, it was normal. Then we did an epilepsy gene panel, and believe it or not, he had a partial deletion of a specific gene. Again, don't memorize the gene. There's no point in that. I don't even have these ones memorized. Why this is super important is because he has the kind of epilepsy where if we give him a B vitamin, vitamin B6, not only does it make seizures go away, but it actually helps the child have normalize their development or help them regain the skills that they didn't have before. It's quite complex about like why giving B6 would help it, but it does. And a couple of years later, he is on B6. He's also on a lysine restricted diet, so that just a certain amino acid is restricted from his diet, and he has not had a seizure since. I'm starting to wean medications, and he's making insane developmental progress. So again, his story, I would not have known that he had this pyridoxine-dependent epilepsy. I could have thought he had Joe or Ben's type of epilepsy, sodium channel mutation. I would not have known that he had this. So this was, again, life-changing for him. So hopefully the summary of the cases kind of points that these are 3 very similar children, 3 similar cases, but 3 dramatically different genetic causes of their epilepsy. And with the correct diagnosis, it changed the management for each person dramatically. So when we think about the future of directions in genetic testing, right now, as you can kind of see, you know, why do we test it at a DNA level? Like, why don't we like test it at a protein level? It's because it's just really hard. It's hard to test the protein or the ultimate product. And so right now we test proteins. I recently listened to like this amazing Grand Rounds, which is a lecture in the hospital about how on a research level, proteins are now being studied. And so just like everything, like we got to give it a few years for the cost to come down and for people to get better at interpretation and actually doing this test. But I think that's the way of the future rather than testing it at a DNA level. There's lots of problems with just testing it at a DNA level. Let's see if we can test it at a protein level. So that's something called proteomics. Also whole genome sequencing. So the genome, so your exome is just the parts of the DNA that code. Whole genome sequencing, which is very expensive right now and primarily only done on a research basis, is testing all of somebody's DNA. So we used to think that like in between the coding DNA, there was all this silent DNA, But what researchers are figuring out is actually this part's important too, and it kind of like tells the protein what to do or how to fold or whatever. And this is one of those things where it's very hard to get at the details as to why somebody has epilepsy or why their brain doesn't function the way it's supposed to. And the truth is probably has a lot to do with the actual what we thought were silent portions of the DNA. So right now I think it's like $50,000 or $100,000 to do this, and it takes a long time. And actually, the interpretation of it is ridiculously expensive as well. The first time this was done, it cost $3 billion. So the cost has to come down dramatically before we're able to do it for children with refractory epilepsy. But just give it some time, just like so much has changed in just my 10 years of practicing. And then the other future direction is more frequent mitochondrial testing. So we didn't touch on this today, and that's because it's something that I would say is pretty infrequently done, because you tend to find the answer earlier on. But this is becoming more, mitochondrial DNA is different than the DNA that I talked about and inherited differently and primarily from a mother, but can cause epilepsy, muscle problems, developmental delays, and regression. And that will be something that as the cost comes down and as people get better at interpreting that data, that will be something that will be able to be done more frequently when we can't find the answers for patients. So as always, when I actually present, I talk a little bit faster than usual, but the take-home points for this talk is that many people with unknown epilepsy cases or previously thought to be unknown epilepsy cases are being found that they're actually due to genetic causes. I would say bring this up with your neurologist. If you have had epilepsy for 10 years, 15 years, and you don't know the cause of it, just ask your neurologist or your epilepsy doctor, could there be a genetic basis here and would there be any point in testing? It's something I actually have to push myself to do in patients that I've been seeing for a while, that like maybe their diagnosis was made or they started having seizures before we were even able to do genetic testing like we are now. I always have to push myself to say, is there something else we should be doing? Is there some other test that we should be doing to get this person the answer? The other take-home point is that they're honestly, most of the time when you walk in the door or have a new diagnosis of epilepsy, or you're kind of trying to find the cause, the three main types of genetic testing are those three things I talked about: the chromosomal microarray, the whole exome sequencing, and a targeted epilepsy gene panel. And so hopefully you now have a little bit better understanding of what those three tests are and some of the limitations of them as well. And then I'd say the most important thing that I feel like I learn on a monthly basis or with every new diagnosis is made is how knowing the genetic cause may dramatically change management. And I gave three very important cases that were real with some details change, how it really changed things. But honestly, this happens all the time and I'm always amazed. I would say the other thing that's important is that let's say you end up with a genetic cause of your epilepsy and it doesn't change management now, it might in future. Just having a label to it or knowing the cause of it, like there's constantly studies being done and constantly new things being learned. The child with the SAN8A mutation, finding out that high dose types of medications would be more efficacious for that child had just been figured out like months before we made the diagnosis. And there's just constantly changes that are being made in medicine, thankfully, right? Because we need to be doing a better job at helping people have less seizures. So I put some good reading information for people who maybe have more questions or who are more interested in maybe interpreting their child's genetic results. I highly recommend meeting with a geneticist or a genetic counselor, especially when you get to whole exome sequencing and some of the more in-depth genetic testing. So I think with that, I'll open it up to any questions that people might have.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. McNamara. That was a fascinating and complex topic, and you did a really great job of making it understandable. So thank you so much. We do have a lot of questions coming in, so let's get right to them. So can you talk about cortical dysplasia, and does that have a genetic component in any case?
Great question. Complex answer, but I'll try to simplify it. But even 5 years ago, people would just say, oh, cortical dysplasia, that's the answer. But nowadays we actually do genetic testing. There are many let me back up. So cortical dysplasia is a malformation of typically the cortex of the brain. So inside the brain is white matter, and outside that gray ribbon is your cortex. You can have malformations or changes in the layering or the organization of the brain. The brain's actually super complex and has 6 layers. And if one layer gets snagged up, you can get like a malformation that forms. Sometimes the malformation can occur because of an injury, or I think what people used to think was from an injury, maybe in utero. But now what we're finding is that there's all kinds of mutations associated with that. Sometimes it ends up being a mutation that affects all the cells in the body, but sometimes it can be just a malformation that just affects those cells in the cortical dysplasia. So we typically start with a blood test to look for a cause. So having a cortical dysplasia nowadays does not preclude you from looking further. So that was an excellent question.
Great. Would it make sense for an adult to get tested? Someone who asked that is 38 and their epilepsy started at age 13 and never really figured out why they have epilepsy, and no one in their family has it.
Absolutely. Yep. And actually testing is pretty similar to what I laid out. I think it's just not as commonly done in adult medicine, but it's starting to be.
And as far as coverage, have you noticed or are you aware of any difference in coverage?
I don't know. When I last took care of adult patients as an epilepsy fellow 5 or 6 years ago, and so at the time, I have to say it was like pulling teeth to get genetic testing, but that was 5 or 6 years ago. So I would just ask. I think that you can make a case for it, a very strong case for it. So just ask. Okay.
And a related question from a different person, also an adult with epilepsy who's refractory. They've done the chromosomal microarray and the epilepsy panel. So I'm guessing did not get anything conclusive. So would you recommend doing whole exome sequencing in that situation?
I think it's definitely worth a discussion with a genetic counselor to see if that would be the right boat for you. But yes, I would say furthermore, when people have whole exome sequencing, sometimes we don't find the answer. We actually re-examine that every 1 to 2 years to see if, because like I said, we're figuring out more and more things all the time on a genetic basis. So even if whole exome sequencing, you didn't find anything, that actually gets re-examined every 1 to 2 years, pretty standardly in people with refractory epilepsy.
Okay. So I'm just going to read this one verbatim. I have a 19-year-old daughter that's well controlled on Keppra. She had 2 seizures 1 month apart at age 13. My mother told me that a couple of her siblings had seizures when babies, but that was in the 1920s, and I don't know the history. They may have been febrile, but I really don't know. Is testing my daughter a good idea?
I think that I would leave it up to your daughter who's 19. I think that would be a reasonable discussion to have. When she was 13, people were not doing the genetic testing that they're doing now. But especially if she's still on medications, I think that would be a reasonable discussion to have, especially since it probably won't, but may or may not have to do with, if she chooses to have children one day, passing something on to those children. Okay. Complex answer that I'll just make short.
So how often is chromosomal microarray included with an epilepsy panel? Do those typically, when you order them, do they typically go together, or do you have to order them separately? Or?
You typically have to order them separately. And for some reason, over the last couple of years, chromosomal microarrays seem to be harder to get. And so you tend to actually are able to get the epilepsy gene panel sometimes before even the chromosomal microarray, okay. Which, as I showed, may not be that big of a deal anymore since the epilepsy gene panel has a higher yield. But you typically can't progress to the whole exome sequencing until you have that chromosomal microarray.
Okay.
Yeah, but they're not standardly done together.
Great. So another case of a daughter diagnosed with juvenile absence epilepsy, and the doctor still ordered genetic testing in that case. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Again, I think some, especially what I found is some of my colleagues who maybe aren't epilepsy doctors who do pediatric neurology, for a while there, they were like, well, why would we do it? But when you find the answer, I don't think, especially with juvenile absence epilepsy, I'm not sure that you're going to find an answer that changes management, but it may change, future family planning, for example.
Okay. Another person asked about how they can be involved in research or genetic research, and asking how they can donate DNA, or is that, do you have any, are you aware offhand of any research agencies or organizations that people can contribute DNA to help to just increase our understanding of genetics?
That's such a good question, and so altruistic of you. I do not know of any just like generic databases right now. I do know, again, because of where I work, I know several researchers for sodium channel mutations. And so sometimes they would like to take people's DNA to study further. But offhand, I don't know of any repository, so I'm sorry, but that's such a kind question.
Yeah, and certainly feel free to contact or contact me and I'd be happy to do some research on some options there. So, okay, we already answered that one. Okay, this is an interesting one. Would genetic testing ever be done in a person who developed seizures in their 60s?
That's such a good question. I'd have to ask Dr. Yousuf that question. Usually when people develop seizures when they're older, especially in their 60s, it tends to be related to like little strokes and things like that. So usually like a cause of an injury. I would bring it up if there wasn't an obvious cause. I guess the likelihood in my head goes a little bit or a lot lower, but it's not zero. So I'll defer that one to Dr. Yousuf.
Great. Can you just briefly talk about what's actually involved in genetic testing? What do patients have to do? You mentioned spitting for one of them and blood tests for the other. Is that pretty much, are those the two things? Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. So for the chromosomal microarray, it's a straightforward blood draw. For most of you can actually do a blood draw for an epilepsy gene panel as well. But then the whole exome sequencing, I would say, is genetic counseling plus a blood draw.
Okay. Where could parents look for studies, new testing that would, if they would like to know about new studies when there's not a definitive diagnosis?
When there's not a definitive diagnosis?
Yeah. I guess I'm not sure from the question if they're asking about research studies or actual tests, but
I guess I could answer that two ways. So I guess if you don't have an answer or a genetic cause, we have, I think I'd start with your physician actually to ask about kind of like what's the newest testing that we could be doing to look for a cause. If you did know a cause though, actually I thought that's where the question was going initially. So like, let's say you have a child with a SCN8A mutation. I actually do the same thing that you do, which is there's a free repository that's kept quite up to date called OMIM, O-M-I-M. And I typically start there for like a general overview of like what's new, what research has shown, because it's actually the researchers themselves who update it. But it's called OMIM, O-M-I-M, and it's open to everyone. And you can look up and it kind of summarizes like what's new about this, about children with this genetic mutation. What does this mean? Any trials going on with it. So it's actually a good site to go on.
Okay.
Sorry if I didn't answer your question.
No, that's really helpful. Is the GNAQ gene not listed because it's so rare or because it's not seen in a blood test?
I would have to look that up.
Okay.
I do not know.
Awesome.
I mean, I was not all inclusive, right? Like that's obvious. And if you notice the chart that I found, which was just a pretty chart, only went up to 2016.
Yeah.
So if that was discovered afterwards, which it may have been, it would not have been listed. Yeah, there's no way to do all inclusive.
Okay. And are genetic tests, both chromosomal and gene panel, are they run through both the patient's insurance and the parent's insurance?
Oh, so you mean when we do parental testing? So most companies actually will run the parents for free. So you can't just do all three at once most of the time. You run the child's test first with the through the gene panel, and then especially the company that we tend to use right now at U of M, the parents, if the kid has like a variant or a change and we need to like figure out like what it means, they run the parents' saliva for free.
Oh, good.
To compare it to.
Great. So another related question in terms of adults getting tested for genetic causes, would this be advantageous for someone who has already had surgery with an RNS placement?
I don't think it would hurt. I don't know how much it would add. Typically when somebody, so you had RNS and not like a resective surgery. And this is important because oftentimes, especially nowadays, if somebody has a resective surgery and their brain has like a malformation on it, we tend to do genetic testing on the actual brain tissue, which is even better than doing it on the blood. But with RNS, I don't think it would hurt. And you've gone through an RNS, you've gone through a lot of costly procedures. Adding a couple $1,000 test to it, I think is incredibly reasonable.
Okay. Should siblings get tested in any situation?
There are some situations where you at least have to consider a sibling being tested, not for, and that's complicated, especially if they're not symptomatic. And this is where a genetic counselor comes in. But let's give an example of a child who develops an epilepsy syndrome that's intractable, that some epilepsy syndromes are progressive. And some of those progressive epilepsies, progressive meaning bad, and the child could worsen. Some of them rarely can have specialized treatments. In those cases, you typically meet with a genetic counselor and will test the other children, especially to try to catch things as soon as possible to start them on a potential treatment. But that is incredibly rare. And I would say in general, most of the time, siblings are not tested.
Okay. Can genetic testing show anything about tendency to develop brain tumors in families? This is someone whose grandmother had a large tumor in the right frontal lobe, and then they started to, the individual asking the question started to develop a tumor, but the tumor stopped developing, and then they didn't have seizures until they were 24 years old. So I guess would that be a situation where maybe the whole exome testing might be helpful because it is looking beyond just epilepsy? Or
it's a good question. I don't know that I know the full answer to it. There are some, not with just brain tumors that I'm aware of. There are some things that run in families where you can develop lots of different kinds of cancers. None that I'm aware of where it's just brain tumors. So
Another person just asked for a little more guidance or information on what is involved in genetic counseling. What can you expect from a typical appointment?
yeah, so a genetic counselor, especially let's say we're talking about whole exome sequencing, they sit down with you and they sort of give you the primer that I just gave you about what's DNA and chromosomes and genes and things like that. And then they talk to you about what kinds of scenarios could come up from the genetic testing, including ambiguous results. So including like, I don't know what this means, or this is, or like the example I gave about, having a mutation in a breast cancer gene and you have a 90% chance of developing breast cancer. So what they do is they talk to you about like, do you want to know that? Do you not want to know it? The other important thing that genetic counselors talk about is sometimes things come up where you find out that, somebody who you thought was your dad is not your dad. And so those are actually really, really important conversations to have before you do the genetic testing. Just to kind of talk about, how do you want to be told information? Do you want all of this information, or do you just want the focused information? And then in the setting of an underage child, are we doing what's right for this child? Are we doing this testing just to be curious, or will this benefit the child in some way? And should we do this testing before the child is of age of consent? So some of it's kind of, background information, but then a lot of it is ethically driven information.
Okay, so that speaks to genetic counseling before getting testing. Is there also genetic counseling that you might get after receiving test results?
Absolutely. So after getting genetic testing done, the genetic counselor goes through the nitty gritty of the details of those results. They talk about whether or not this was a gene that was passed down from parents, or if this was one that was just in the child. They'll also talk about it, especially if it was passed down from parents, what's the likelihood of having another child with this, genetic mutation, presumably, or in that child, what does this mean for the child if they want to have children one day? So that's why it's important to do the genetic counseling before and afterwards.
Okay, great. So I have one more question, and you can say no if you don't want to try to answer this one, but can you talk about whether epigenetics eventually may have a role in epilepsy, and whether testing would be able to elucidate anything on that?
Yeah, so and this is where it's the disclosure that I'm not a geneticist, but epigenetics is sort of like more detailed genetics that play a role in how our proteins functions and things like that. I mean, I think it's too early to use it on a daily basis now. I think we just have to give it more time, just like we have to give the whole genome testing more time. I think that we'll know more. I mean, give them like 5 years, right? Like they just need, the researchers just need, a little bit more time to help elucidate it and help us figure out how to use it, especially in epilepsy, clinically.
Okay, great. Well, timing has worked out just perfectly. So thank you again for a really great presentation and a great discussion afterwards. And thanks everyone for all of your great questions and comments.